The ballroom went silent the second she walked in. Not because of beauty, not because of grace, but because a plus-size woman in mud-stained boots had just stumbled into the most exclusive engagement party Wyoming had ever seen, and everyone was staring. Within minutes, she'd be accused of fraud, publicly humiliated, dragged toward the frozen night to die. Then the ranching empire's most eligible heir said 3 words that detonated the entire room. "She's my wife." This is the story of the woman they mocked, who became more powerful than any of them. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The wagon had stopped moving 3 miles back. Rosalie Mercer sat alone in the darkness, watching her breath frost in the air, wondering if this was how people froze to death in Wyoming, not dramatically, not fighting, just sitting still while the cold worked its way through threadbare wool and into bone. The driver had left her at a crossroads with vague directions and a shrug that said, "Your problem now, lady." He'd taken her last $2 for the ride and hadn't even pretended to feel bad about it. She should have known better. Should have asked more questions before boarding that train in Kansas City 3 weeks ago. Should have demanded a contract, references, something more than a handwritten letter promising sewing work at a respectable ranch household. But hungry people don't ask questions. Desperate people just move. Rosalie adjusted the bundle of fabric samples under her arm and started walking. The Blackthorne estate was supposed to be close, just beyond the ridge according to the driver who'd abandoned her. Her boots, already worn thin from factory floors back east, crunched through frozen grass. The dress she wore, her only decent one, had been carefully mended so many times the seams formed a map of survival across faded blue cotton. The wind hit different out here. Back in Philadelphia, cold meant crowds and cramped tenements and the sour smell of too many people in too little space. Out here, cold meant space. Endless space. The kind that swallowed sound and made a person feel like the last living thing on earth. She kept moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering the foreman's face when he told her the garment factory was closing. Meant remembering her landlady's satisfaction while evicting her. Meant remembering the specific shade of pity in her sister's eyes when Rosalie asked to stay just 1 more month and heard, "I can't keep doing this." So she'd run. Taken the first job offer that came, even though it meant crossing half the country to a place she'd never heard of for people she'd never met. The ridge turned out to be farther than it looked. By the time Rosalie crested the hill, her lungs burned and her thighs ached, and she'd stopped feeling her toes entirely. But the view stole what little breath she had left. The Blackthorne estate sprawled across the valley like something out of a storybook, if the storybook was about money and power instead of magic. The main house stood 3 stories tall, built from dark timber and stone, surrounded by barns and outbuildings that looked bigger than the entire tenement block she'd left behind. Lantern light blazed from every window. Even from a distance, she could hear music. Rosalie's stomach dropped. The letter hadn't mentioned a party, hadn't mentioned arriving in the middle of anything except quiet autumn work. She looked down at herself, the mud-splattered hem, the worn boots, the coat that had been patched so many times it was more thread than fabric. She almost turned around, almost walked back into the darkness and took her chances with the cold. But there was nowhere to go back to. No room waiting in Philadelphia, no factory job, no sister who'd open her door. Rosalie straightened her shoulders, tucked a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear, and started down the hill toward all that light. The closer she got, the worse it looked. This wasn't a small gathering. Carriages lined the circular drive, expensive ones, polished and new, pulled by horses that probably ate better than she had in months. Well-dressed people moved between the main house and what looked like a separate ballroom building, their laughter carrying across the cold air. Rosalie approached a side entrance, hoping to find a servant's door, somewhere she could slip in quietly and ask for Mrs. Blackthorne without causing a scene. Instead, she nearly collided with a broad-shouldered man in an expensive suit who was stepping out for a cigar. "Careful there," he said, then stopped. His eyes traveled from her face down to her boots and back up again. "You lost?" "I'm looking for Mrs. Blackthorne," Rosalie said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I'm here about the sewing position." The man's expression shifted to something between amusement and disbelief. "Tonight?" "The letter said to arrive in October. It's October. It's also the engagement party." He took a long pull from his cigar, studying her. "You really didn't know?" Rosalie's face burned despite the cold. The letter didn't mention... Well, you can't go in looking like that, he said, not unkindly, just stating fact. Head around back. Find the kitchen entrance. Someone there can sort you out. But before Rosalie could move, a woman's voice cut through the night, sharp and irritated. Thomas, what's taking so long? Catherine's about to make the toast and Damien's disappeared again. The speaker emerged from the doorway, a striking woman in her 40s wearing emerald silk that probably cost more than Rosalie had earned in her entire life. She stopped mid-sentence, staring. Who is this? Seamstress, apparently, Thomas said. Showed up for a sewing job. The woman's eyes narrowed. Tonight? That's what I said. Rosalie opened her mouth to explain, to apologize, to do something other than stand there being examined like a stain on expensive fabric. But the woman had already dismissed her, turning back to Thomas. Get her away from the main entrance. If Victor Hale sees some vagabond wandering around, he'll use it as an excuse to insult our hospitality. She glanced back at Rosalie with the kind of look that made clear exactly how much space she occupied and how little of it was welcome. You. Go around back. Wait in the kitchen. Someone will deal with you after the party. The woman swept back inside without waiting for a response. That's Mrs. Blackthorne, Thomas said unnecessarily. Listen, take my advice. Wait in the kitchen, like she said. Get warm. Get some food. This'll all be over in a few hours. Rosalie nodded, unable to trust her voice. But as Thomas moved to follow Mrs. Blackthorne inside, a gust of wind caught the door, swinging it wide open, and Rosalie saw inside. The entrance hall was full of people, women in gowns that shimmered under chandelier light, men in tailored suits, everyone holding crystal glasses and laughing. Beyond them, through another set of open doors, she glimpsed the ballroom itself. More people, more light, more everything. For just a second, Rosalie forgot she wasn't supposed to be there, forgot she was meant to hide in the kitchen like something shameful. She'd spent 3 weeks traveling across the country, sleeping on train station benches, eating nothing but hard bread and hope. She'd earned the right to at least see what all that suffering had brought her to. She stepped inside. Thomas called after her, "Wait, that's not..." But she was already moving, drawn by warmth and light and the stubborn ember of pride that poverty hadn't quite managed to extinguish. The entrance hall fell silent so fast it felt like someone had thrown a blanket over the world. Every face turned toward her. The musicians in the ballroom faltered mid-note. Conversations died mid-word. Rosalie froze. She'd been stared at before, been examined, judged, dismissed, had endured the particular kind of cruelty that came with being a plus-size woman in a world that treated her body like a moral failing. But this was different. This wasn't the casual contempt of strangers on a street corner. This was dozens of wealthy, powerful people all reaching the same conclusion simultaneously. She doesn't belong here. A woman near the front, young, blonde, wearing a dress that probably required 3 people to get her into, giggled behind her gloved hand. The sound was small, but it spread like fire, little bursts of laughter rippling through the crowd. "Oh my word," someone whispered, loud enough to carry. "Is that a cook?" "Too fat to be a maid?" another voice added. "Must be lost." Or drunk. Rosalie's face burned. She should leave, should turn around and walk right back out into the cold and never think about this moment again. But her feet wouldn't move. Some stubborn part of her refused to give them the satisfaction of watching her run. A new voice cut through the whispers, older, male, heavy with authority and disdain. "Mrs. Blackthorne, I believe you have an intruder." The crowd parted like a curtain, revealing a silver-haired man in an expensive suit standing beside the blonde woman in the elaborate dress. Even without introduction, Rosalie knew power when she saw it. This man wore authority like other people wore cologne. Deliberately, excessively, impossible to ignore. Mrs. Blackthorne appeared at his side, her face tight with barely controlled fury. "I apologize, Mr. Hale. This is simply a misunderstanding. The girl arrived at an unfortunate time and..." "The girl," Rosalie said, finding her voice somewhere between humiliation and anger, "was invited. I have a letter from this household offering employment." Mrs. Blackthorne's expression could have frozen whiskey. Employment that was to begin discreetly, not... "Let me see this letter," Hale interrupted. extending his hand with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. Rosalie hesitated. The letter was in her bag along with everything else she owned, which wasn't much. Handing it over felt like surrendering her only proof that she had any right to be in Wyoming at all. But refusing seemed worse. She dug through her bag and produced the envelope, now crumpled and stained from weeks of travel. Hale examined it with the expression of someone inspecting spoiled meat. "This is dated September. It's October now." "I left as soon as I received it," Rosalie said. "Travel takes time when you can't afford—" "Catherine." Hale turned to Mrs. Blackthorne, ignoring Rosalie entirely. "This letter is signed by your son." The whispers started again, louder now, tinged with something uglier than amusement. Mrs. Blackthorne went very still. "I beg your pardon?" "Damien's signature." Hale held up the letter like evidence at a trial. "Right there at the bottom." Rosalie's stomach dropped. She'd assumed the letter came from Mrs. Blackthorne herself, had never thought to question why a rancher's son would be hiring seamstresses. "That's impossible," Mrs. Blackthorne said, but her voice had lost its certainty. "Is it?" The blonde woman at Hale's side spoke for the first time, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "Damien has been acting strangely for months, disappearing, making excuses. I thought he was just nervous about the engagement, but perhaps—" "Don't be absurd, Margaret," Mrs. Blackthorne snapped. "My son wouldn't—" "Wouldn't what?" Hale's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "Wouldn't invite some desperate woman to his family home? Wouldn't promise her employment as cover for something else?" The implication hit Rosalie like a slap. "I don't know your son. I've never met anyone named Damien. I answered a job advertisement. That's all." "Of course you did," Margaret said, her smile sharp. "I'm sure it's all perfectly innocent. A plus-size seamstress travels halfway across the country based on a mysterious letter from a wealthy bachelor. Nothing suspicious about that." Laughter erupted around them. Not the nervous titters from before, but genuine amusement now that someone had given them permission to be cruel. Rosalie felt something crack inside her chest. Not breaking, just cracking. The kind of damage that would leave marks. "Search her bag," someone called out. "Check for more letters. Maybe she's got love notes hidden." "Enough!" A new voice, male and sharp, cut through the chaos. The crowd shifted again, and a man pushed through from the ballroom. Tall, dark-haired, maybe 30, dressed in formal wear that looked deliberately rumpled, like he'd been tugging at the collar. His face was striking in a hard-edged way. Sharp jaw, dark eyes, the kind of features that looked better angry than happy. He stopped in the center of the hall and looked directly at Rosalie. She stared back, confused and terrified and still trying to understand what was happening. "Damien," Mrs. Blackthorne said, relief and warning tangled in her voice. "This woman claims you sent her a letter." "I did," he said. The hall went silent again, but this was a different kind of silence. Heavier, dangerous. "You did what?" Mrs. Blackthorne's voice was barely a whisper. Damien didn't look away from Rosalie. His expression was unreadable. Not angry, not kind, just calculating, like he was working out a problem and she was part of the equation. "I sent the letter," he said again, louder, "and I invited her here." Margaret's hand flew to her throat in a gesture so theatrical it would have been funny under different circumstances. "Damien, what are you saying?" Hale's face had gone red. "Boy, if this is some kind of joke—" "It's not a joke." Damien finally broke eye contact with Rosalie and turned to face his mother, Hale, and the assembled crowd. "And she's not a seamstress." Rosalie's heart hammered so hard she thought everyone must hear it. Damien took a breath, squared his shoulders, and said the words that would change everything. "She's my wife." For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The declaration hung in the air like smoke, impossible and absurd and completely unretractable. Then the ballroom exploded. Voices crashed over each other, shouting, gasping, demanding explanations. Margaret let out a shriek that probably scared wildlife 3 counties over. Mrs. Blackthorne swayed like she might faint. Hale's face went from red to purple, and Rosalie just stood there, frozen, while the world caught fire around her. Damien moved toward her through the chaos. Up close, she could see the tension in his jaw, the calculation in his eyes. This wasn't romance, this wasn't rescue. This was strategy. He reached her, leaned down and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear beneath the shouting. I know you don't know me. I know this is insane. But if you want to survive the next 5 minutes, you need to trust me and play along. Rosalie's mind reeled. What? Do you have somewhere else to go tonight? He asked bluntly. Any other option besides this? She thought of the empty prairie, the cold, the $3 left in her bag that wouldn't even buy a train ticket to the nearest town. No, she whispered. Then take my hand, Damien said. And don't let go. Rosalie looked at his outstretched palm, at the crowd of furious, beautiful people who wanted her destroyed, at Mrs. Blackthorne's horrified face and Margaret's murderous expression. She thought about the factory foreman who'd fired her, the landlady who'd evicted her, her sister who'd turned her away, every person who'd ever looked at her body and decided she was worth less because of it. And she thought, what do I have to lose that I haven't already lost? Rosalie put her hand in Damien's. His fingers closed around hers, warm, solid, real. When did this happen? Hale's voice cut through the noise like a blade. When did you allegedly marry this woman? July, Damien said without hesitation. In Denver. That's a lie, Margaret said, her voice shaking. You were here in July. We went riding together. You attended my father's birthday. I went to Denver for 3 days in the middle of the month, Damien countered. Said I was looking at breeding stock. Nobody questioned it. Mrs. Blackthorne finally found her voice. Damien, stop this right now. Whatever you think you're doing, I'm telling the truth, Mother. He squeezed Rosalie's hand, whether in reassurance or warning, she couldn't tell. Rosalie and I were married in Denver. We kept it secret because I knew how you'd react, but I'm not hiding it anymore. You expect us to believe, Hale said slowly, that you married this woman and then sent her away for months while you continued courting my daughter? I expect you to believe what's true, Damien shot back, whether you like it or not. The crowd pressed closer, hungry for details, for blood, for anything scandalous enough to make this party memorable. A woman in purple silk pushed forward. If you're truly married, where's the certificate? In a bank in Denver, Damien said smoothly. For safekeeping. How convenient, Margaret sneered. No certificate. No witnesses, no proof except your word, and this, she gestured at Rosalie like she was pointing out a stain. This woman who looks like she's been sleeping in barns. Careful, Margaret, Damien's voice dropped into something cold. You're talking about my wife. Your wife, Margaret laughed, high and sharp. You really expect anyone to believe that you, Damien Blackthorne, heir to the largest ranch in Wyoming, married some fat nobody? The word hit Rosalie like a physical blow. She'd been called worse, had been called everything worse, but hearing it here, in front of all these people, while pretending to be married to a man she'd met 5 minutes ago, her hand started to slip from Damien's. He held tighter. Yes, Damien said clearly. That's exactly what I expect you to believe. Hale stepped forward, his voice dangerously quiet. We had an agreement, boy, your family and mine. Your mother gave her word. I gave my word to Rosalie first, Damien interrupted. Everything else comes second. Mrs. Blackthorne made a sound like a wounded animal. Rosalie's head spun. This couldn't be real, couldn't be happening. Any second now she'd wake up on the wagon, still 3 miles away, and this would all be a fever dream brought on by hunger and cold. But Damien's hand was warm and real, and the fury in Margaret's eyes was definitely not imaginary. This is fraud, Hale said flatly, clear as day. You invented this marriage to get out of your obligations. Prove it, Damien challenged. I will. Hale turned to his daughter. Margaret, dear, fetch my lawyer. We're not letting this stand. Daddy, now. Margaret fled in a rustle of expensive fabric and barely contained tears. Mrs. Blackthorne grabbed her son's arm. Damien, please, think about what you're doing. The ranch, the contracts, everything we've built. I have thought about it, Damien said, and for the first time Rosalie heard something genuine in his voice beneath the performance. I've thought about nothing else for months. Then you know this is suicide, his mother hissed. Victor Hale will destroy us. He'll call in every debt, turn every ally against us, ruin. Maybe. Damien's jaw set. But I'm done being sold like cattle. The words seemed to hit Mrs. Blackthorne harder than anything else that had been said. She released his arm and stepped back, her face pale. You'll regret this, she whispered. Probably, Damien agreed. A man in an expensive coat pushed through the crowd. Hale's lawyer, Rosalie assumed, based on the leather folder he carried and the predatory gleam in his eye. "Mr. Blackthorne," the lawyer said with oily courtesy, "I'm afraid I must ask you and your wife to produce documentation of this marriage immediately. Without proper verification, these claims constitute fraud and breach of contract with the Hale family." "The certificate is in Denver," Damien repeated. "Then we'll wait while someone fetches it," the lawyer said smoothly. "Until then, I must insist that this woman be removed from the premises and held for questioning." "She's not going anywhere," Damien said. "She's a criminal suspect. She's my wife, and she stays with me." The lawyer smiled. "Then you'll both be detained. I'm sure the local sheriff will be happy to sort this out." Rosalie's throat went tight. She'd heard stories about frontier justice, about what happened to women accused of fraud, or worse. Nothing good. Damien must have felt her panic because he pulled her closer, his voice low. "Stay calm. I have a plan." "A plan that involves us both going to jail?" Rosalie whispered back. "A plan that involves buying time." He raised his voice to address the crowd. "Fine. Send for the sheriff, but this party isn't over until he arrives, and until then, Rosalie stays here as my guest." "Your guest?" Hale said flatly. "Not your wife?" "My wife," Damien corrected, "who is also my guest." "This is absurd," Mrs. Blackthorne said. "This is my house," Damien shot back, "and she stays." The lawyer started to protest, but Hale raised a hand. "Let them have their little charade. The sheriff will straighten this out soon enough." He smiled, cold and certain. "Enjoy your last few hours of freedom, Mr. Blackthorne. Both of you." The crowd began to disperse, breaking into smaller groups, everyone talking at once. Servants appeared to refresh drinks. The musicians, uncertain, started playing again. The party continued, but everything had changed. Rosalie could feel eyes on her from every corner, curious, hostile, amused. She'd become the evening's entertainment. Damien kept hold of her hand and led her away from the main hall, toward a smaller sitting room off to the side. The moment they were alone, he released her and stepped back. "Sorry," he said. "About all of that." Rosalie stared at him. "You're sorry?" "I didn't have a choice." "Everyone has a choice," she said, her voice shaking. "You chose to lie about marrying me. You chose to throw me into the middle of whatever nightmare you're running from. You chose—" "You're right," Damien cut her off. "I did choose, and now you have a choice too." Rosalie wrapped her arms around herself. "What choice? The lawyer said we're both criminals now." "Only if they can prove the marriage is fake," Damien said, "and they can't prove that if we don't let them." "What are you talking about?" Damien moved to the window, looking out at the party guests milling around the grounds. "I need you to pretend to be my wife. For real. Not just tonight. For as long as it takes to make this stick." Rosalie laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're insane." "Probably." He turned back to face her. "But I'm also desperate, and I'm guessing you are too, or you wouldn't have traveled across the country for a sewing job that probably doesn't even exist." The words stung because they were true. "What do you get out of this?" Rosalie asked. "Freedom," Damien said simply. "From Victor Hale, from an arranged marriage, from being a bargaining chip in my mother's business deals. And you get safety, money, a place to stay. Until the sheriff proves we're lying and we both go to prison." "That won't happen if we're convincing enough." Rosalie shook her head. "Nobody's going to believe that you married me. Look at me. Look at you. Look at—" She gestured vaguely at everything. "All of this." "People believe what they want to believe," Damien said. "And right now, the only thing that matters is whether we can sell this story better than Hale can tear it down." "Why should I help you? You lied about me. Used me." "Because you have nowhere else to go," Damien said bluntly. "Because winter's coming, and you're broke, and you don't know anyone in this territory. Because if you walk out that door right now, you'll freeze before morning." Rosalie hated that he was right. Hated that she was even considering this. "And if I say no?" she asked. Damien was quiet for a moment. "Then I'll give you enough money to get to the nearest town and find a room. No strings attached. You can disappear and forget any of this happened." "And you?" He shrugged. "I'll marry Margaret Hale and spend the rest of my life wishing I'd had the courage to run." There was something raw in his voice that made Rosalie look at him more carefully. Beneath the expensive clothes and the practiced confidence, She saw exhaustion, fear, the same kind of trapped desperation she'd felt back in Philadelphia when the walls closed in and every door locked. Different circumstances. Same cage. "If I agree," Rosalie said slowly, "what happens? We convince everyone we're married, we act like it, live like it, make it real enough that no lawyer in Wyoming can prove otherwise." "For how long?" "A year," Damien said. "After that, the engagement contract with the Hales expires anyway. We can quietly divorce and go our separate ways." "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime, you're the wife of a wealthy rancher. You'll have clothes, food, a room of your own, protection. From everyone except the people who want to destroy us," Rosalie pointed out. "I won't let anything happen to you," Damien said. "You don't even know me." "No," he agreed, "but I know desperation when I see it, and I know you're tougher than you look, or you wouldn't have made it this far." Rosalie wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she wasn't tough, that she'd barely survived the journey here and had no idea how to survive what came next. But before she could speak, the door burst open. Mrs. Blackthorne stood in the doorway, her face a mask of controlled fury. "The sheriff's arrived. He wants to speak with both of you. Now." Damien looked at Rosalie. Last chance, yes or no? Rosalie thought about Philadelphia, about the factory, about her sister's closed door, about sleeping on train station benches and rationing bread and the specific kind of cold that came from having absolutely nothing and no one. She thought about Margaret's sneer and the lawyer's predatory smile, and the way every person at that party had looked at her like she was less than human, and she thought, if I'm going to be destroyed anyway, I might as well make it mean something. "Yes," Rosalie said. Damien's shoulders dropped half an inch in relief. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Rosalie said. "We might both be in jail by morning." "Probably." He offered his arm. "Mrs. Blackthorne?" Rosalie hesitated, then took his arm. The fabric of his jacket was soft under her fingers, expensive wool, probably imported, the kind of thing she'd only ever touched while sewing it for someone else. Mrs. Blackthorne's expression could have curdled milk. "I hope you know what you're doing." "Not even a little bit," Damien said. They walked back into the ballroom together, Rosalie's hand on Damien's arm, both of them walking toward the sheriff and whatever came next. The crowd parted around them like a diseased thing. Rosalie kept her chin up and her eyes forward, refusing to flinch under their stares. The sheriff stood near the entrance, a weathered man in his 50s with hard eyes and a badge that looked older than him. He studied Rosalie and Damien with the expression of someone used to sorting truth from lies. "Mr. Blackthorne," the sheriff said, "I hear we've got ourselves a situation." "No situation," Damien said calmly. "Just a misunderstanding." "That's so?" The sheriff's eyes moved to Rosalie. "This the woman you claim to have married?" "Not claim," Damien corrected. "Did marry. In Denver, July 15th. The sheriff pulled out a small notebook. "And you are?" "Rosalie Mercer," she said, then corrected herself. "Rosalie Blackthorne." The name felt foreign in her mouth, like wearing someone else's clothes. "Witnesses to this marriage?" the sheriff asked. "The minister who performed the ceremony," Damien said. "And 2 people from the church who served as witnesses. I can provide names if you'd like to verify." The sheriff wrote something down. "I would, but that'll take time." "We have time," Damien said. Hale stepped forward. "Sheriff, this is clearly fraud. The boy invented this marriage to avoid his legal obligations." "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Hale," the sheriff said. "You got proof?" "The timing alone is suspicious," Hale said. "He waits until the night of his engagement party to reveal this secret marriage? That's not suspicious to you?" "Suspicious isn't the same as illegal," the sheriff said. "Without proof of fraud, I can't arrest anyone." "Then get proof," Hale demanded. "I'm working on it." The sheriff turned back to Damien and Rosalie. "In the meantime, you 2 aren't leaving the territory. Understood?" "Understood," Damien said. The sheriff nodded and tucked his notebook away. "I'll be in touch once I hear back from Denver. Could be a few days, could be a few weeks, depending on how fast the telegraph moves." "We'll be here," Damien said. The sheriff tipped his hat and left, taking some of the tension with him, but not all of it. The party was dying now, guests making excuses and calling for their carriages. Nobody wanted to stay for the rest of whatever disaster this was becoming. Margaret appeared one last time, her face blotchy from crying. "I loved you," she said to Damien, her voice breaking. "I actually loved you." "No, you didn't," Damien said quietly. "You loved what I represented. The ranch, the money, the status. You never loved me." "And she does?" Margaret gestured at Rosalie with contempt. "This stranger who showed up tonight out of nowhere?" Damien looked at Rosalie. His expression was unreadable. "Yes," he said. Margaret let out a sob and fled. Hale watched his daughter go, then turned to Damien with cold precision. "This isn't over. I'll prove you're lying, and when I do, I'll destroy you and everything your family has built." "You're welcome to try," Damien said. Hale left without another word, his lawyer scurrying after him. The ballroom slowly emptied until only servants remained, cleaning up the debris of the ruined party. Mrs. Blackthorne approached them, her face pale. "I need to speak with my son. Alone." Damien squeezed Rosalie's hand. "Whatever you have to say to me, you can say in front of my wife." His mother flinched at the word. "Very well." She took a breath. "You've made your choice. Now you'll live with the consequences. But understand this. I will not let the Blackthorne name be dragged through the mud. If this marriage is real, you'll act like it. If it's a lie," she looked at Rosalie, "then you'd better be the most convincing liar I've ever met." "I'm not lying," Damien said. "We'll see." Mrs. Blackthorne turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. The guest rooms are full from the party. She'll have to stay in your room." Damien went very still. "Mother, you're married, aren't you?" Mrs. Blackthorne said coldly. "Then act like it." She left them standing in the empty ballroom, surrounded by discarded champagne glasses and wilting flowers. Damien ran a hand through his hair. "I'll sleep on the floor." "What?" Rosalie said. "In my room. I'll sleep on the floor. You can have the bed." The absurdity of it hit Rosalie all at once, standing in a ballroom in Wyoming, discussing sleeping arrangements with a man she'd met an hour ago who just claimed to be her husband. She started laughing, couldn't help it. The laugh came up from somewhere deep and desperate and verging on hysteria. Damien watched her with concern. "Are you okay?" "No," Rosalie said, still laughing. "I'm really not okay." "Fair enough." He waited until her laughter subsided. "Come on, let's get you upstairs before you collapse." Rosalie let him lead her through the house, too exhausted to take in much beyond the overwhelming sense of space and wealth. How many rooms did one family need? How many hallways? How much of everything? Damien's room was on the third floor, facing west. He opened the door and stepped back to let her enter first. The room was bigger than the apartment Rosalie had shared with two other girls back in Philadelphia. A massive bed dominated one wall, a fireplace, windows with actual curtains, furniture that matched. "I'll get some blankets for the floor," Damien said. "And tomorrow we'll figure out what to do about clothes." Rosalie looked down at herself. The dress that had seemed decent enough in Philadelphia looked pathetic here. "I have another dress," she said, "in my bag." "We'll need more than that," Damien said. "If you're going to be my wife, you'll need to look the part." "I can sew," Rosalie offered. That wasn't a lie. "We'll hire a seamstress," Damien said, "or buy ready-made, whatever's fastest." Rosalie bristled. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity. It's survival." Damien pulled blankets from a chest at the foot of the bed. "If you show up to Sunday services in a worn-out dress, everyone will know something's wrong. We need to sell this, Rosalie, completely." He was right. She hated that he was right. "Bathroom's through that door," Damien said, pointing. "There's hot water if you want to wash up." Hot water. A bathroom. Privacy. Rosalie felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back furiously. She would not cry in front of this stranger. "Thank you," she managed. Damien nodded and started making his bed on the floor. Rosalie escaped into the bathroom and locked the door. Only then did she let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. She'd traveled across the country for a job that didn't exist, had stumbled into an engagement party, had been publicly humiliated, accused of fraud, and claimed as a wife by a man she'd never met. And she'd agreed to it, had looked at the impossible situation and said yes. Rosalie caught sight of herself in the mirror, mud-stained, exhausted, wearing someone else's lie like a poorly fitted dress. "What have you done?" she whispered to her reflection. But the woman in the mirror had no answer, just the same tired eyes and the same stubborn jaw that had gotten her this far. Rosalie washed her face with hot water that felt like luxury, changed into her other dress, which was only marginally better than the first, tried to prepare herself for whatever came next. When she emerged from the bathroom, Damien was already settled on the floor, one arm tucked under his head, staring at the ceiling. "You okay?" he asked, without looking at her. "Ask me in the morning," Rosalie said. She climbed into the bed, the softest thing she'd felt in years, and pulled the covers up. The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, wind rattled the windows. "Rosalie?" Damien's voice came from the darkness. "Yeah?" "For what it's worth, I'm sorry for dragging you into this." Rosalie thought about that, about choices and desperation, and the narrow space between survival and surrender. "You didn't drag me," she said finally. "I chose." "Why?" "Because I'm tired of being afraid," Rosalie said, "and because I have nothing left to lose." Damien was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Me too." They lay there in the darkness, two strangers bound by a lie, waiting for morning and whatever it would bring. Outside, somewhere in the Wyoming night, Victor Hale was already planning his revenge, and Rosalie Blackthorne now, was about to learn that surviving was only the beginning. The real battle hadn't even started yet. Rosalie woke to sunlight cutting through unfamiliar curtains and the immediate, disorienting certainty that everything from the night before had been real. She lay still for a moment, taking inventory. Soft mattress, clean sheets, the faint smell of wood smoke from a fire that had burned down to embers, and from somewhere below, the unmistakable sounds of a large household waking up, footsteps, voices, the clatter of dishes. She turned her head and found Damien's makeshift bed on the floor empty, blankets folded with military precision. A knock at the door made her jolt upright. "Mrs. Blackthorne?" A woman's voice, unfamiliar and carefully neutral. "I've brought breakfast and some clothes for you to try." Rosalie's throat went dry. Mrs. Blackthorne. They were calling her Mrs. Blackthorne now. "Come in," she managed. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 30s carrying a tray, followed by a younger girl struggling under the weight of several dresses draped over her arms. Both wore servants' uniforms and identical expressions of poorly concealed curiosity. The older woman set the tray on a side table. "Mr. Blackthorne asked that we bring you something to wear. We weren't sure of your size, so we brought options." Translation: they'd guessed she was fat and brought the biggest dresses they could find. Rosalie pushed down the familiar burn of humiliation. "Thank you." The younger girl laid the dresses across a chair, sneaking glances at Rosalie like she was a museum exhibit. The older woman elbowed her sharply. "Will you be needing help dressing, ma'am?" The question was polite, but Rosalie caught the edge underneath. These women didn't know what to make of her yet. Didn't know if she was truly the mistress of the house or some kind of fraud who'd be gone by nightfall. "I can manage," Rosalie said. They left, closing the door with a soft click that somehow felt louder than a slam. Rosalie examined the dresses. They were nice, nicer than anything she'd ever owned, but clearly pulled from storage or borrowed from someone else. One had been let out at the seams recently. Another had moth holes carefully mended. These weren't new purchases. They were makeshift solutions. She chose the simplest one, a dark green day dress that fit well enough if she didn't breathe too deeply, and forced herself to eat the breakfast even though her stomach felt like a clenched fist. Cold toast, eggs that had gone rubbery, tea that had steeped too long, the food of people who weren't sure she deserved hot meals yet. When she finally worked up the courage to leave the bedroom, she found Damien waiting in the hallway. He looked like he hadn't slept much either, dark circles under his eyes, jaw tight with tension. "Good morning," he said, the words formal and strange. "Is it?" Rosalie asked. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Debatable." He offered his arm. "My mother wants to see us, both of us, in her study." "That sounds ominous." "It is." They walked through the house in daylight, and Rosalie got her first real look at the place she'd agreed to call home. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, portraits of stern-faced Blackthorns staring down from the walls like judges. Everything was heavy, expensive, built to last generations. It felt like walking through a museum or a mausoleum. Damien knocked on a door near the back of the house and entered without waiting for permission. Mrs. Blackthorne sat behind a massive desk covered in ledgers and correspondence. She looked up as they entered, her expression unreadable. "Sit," she said. They sat. Mrs. Blackthorne studied them for a long moment, her fingers steepled under her chin. "I spent most of last night trying to determine whether you're both insane or simply stupid." "Mother, I haven't decided yet." She opened one of the ledgers. "Victor Hale sent word this morning. He's hired investigators. They'll be arriving from Denver within the week to look into your alleged marriage." Rosalie's stomach dropped. "Let them come," Damien said. "We're prepared." "Are you?" Mrs. Blackthorne's eyes shifted to Rosalie. "Tell me, dear, where did you and my son meet?" The question was a trap. Rosalie knew it, knew Mrs. Blackthorne was testing whether they'd coordinated their story. "In Denver," Rosalie said carefully, "at a social gathering." "What kind of gathering?" Rosalie's mind raced. She had no idea what kind of social events happened in Denver, no idea what Damien would have attended. "A church fundraiser," Damien cut in smoothly. "For the new orphanage. Rosalie was helping with the sewing for the children's clothes." Mrs. Blackthorne's eyebrow lifted. "How charitable. And you were so taken with her needlework that you proposed on the spot?" "It wasn't the needlework," Damien said. "It was her." The words hung in the air. Rosalie felt her face heat. Mrs. Blackthorne's expression didn't change. "Investigators won't be charmed by vague romance. They'll want dates, names, witnesses. They'll want to know what Rosalie wore to the ceremony, what the minister's name was, what you had for dinner afterward." "We know all that," Damien said. "Do you?" Mrs. Blackthorne turned to Rosalie. "What did you wear?" Rosalie opened her mouth and realized she had no answer. They hadn't discussed any of this, hadn't prepared. "A blue dress," she said finally. "Simple, no lace." "What color blue?" "Navy." "And the minister's name?" Rosalie looked at Damien, panicking. "Reverend Walsh," Damien said, "from the First Presbyterian Church on Larimer Street." Mrs. Blackthorne made a note. "I'll have someone verify that. If there is no Reverend Walsh, or if the church has no record of you, they'll have a record," Damien said with more confidence than Rosalie felt. Mrs. Blackthorne set down her pen. "I want to believe you, I do, because the alternative is that my son has committed fraud and dragged this family into a legal nightmare that could cost us everything." She looked at Rosalie. "But I need the truth. Are you truly married to my son?" The question was direct, unavoidable. Rosalie thought about lying, about maintaining the fiction. But Mrs. Blackthorne's eyes were too sharp, too knowing. "Yes," Rosalie said, meeting her gaze. "We are." The lie came out smooth, convincing, almost like truth. Mrs. Blackthorne held her stare for another long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well. Then here's what happens next. You'll attend church with us on Sunday. You'll smile, act appropriately, and show this community that you're a proper wife. You'll learn how to run this household. You'll study the ranch accounts so you can speak intelligently about our business. And most importantly," she leaned forward, "you will give Victor Hale and his investigators absolutely nothing to work with. No inconsistencies, no mistakes, no proof." "We won't," Damien said. "See that you don't." Mrs. Blackthorne returned to her ledgers. "Now get out. I have actual work to do." They left the study in silence. Once they were safely in the hallway, Rosalie let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "Reverend Walsh?" she whispered. "Real person," Damien said. "Real church. I gambled that my mother wouldn't know the names of every minister in Denver. And if she checks, then we'd better hope Walsh is the forgiving type." Damien ran a hand through his hair. "We need to get our story straight. Every detail. Before those investigators arrive. How long do we have?" "A week. Maybe less if Hale pays for faster travel. A week to build a believable marriage out of nothing. A week to learn each other well enough to fool professionals trained to spot lies." "This is impossible," Rosalie said. "Probably." Damien glanced around to make sure they were alone. "But we don't have a choice now. We're committed." The word hit Rosalie strange. Committed. like they'd done something permanent when really they'd just made everything worse. I need to know things about you, Damien said. Real things. Where you grew up, family history, what you like, what you hate, everything. Why? Because married people know each other. If I can't tell an investigator what your favorite food is, or what you do when you're nervous, they'll know we're lying. Rosalie's jaw tightened. I bite my nails when I'm nervous. I hate fish. I grew up in Philadelphia in a tenement that should have been condemned. My father died when I was 12 and my mother followed 6 months later. I have one sister who'd rather pretend I don't exist. I worked in a garment factory until it closed and then I ran out of options. She met his eyes. Your turn. Damien blinked, clearly not expecting that level of honesty. I grew up here, he said slowly. Only child. My father died 5 years ago. Left everything to my mother, who's been trying to run the ranch and marry me off to secure alliances ever since. I hate being told what to do. I hate that everyone in this territory thinks they own a piece of my future. And I hate that the only way I could see to escape was to lie to a stranger and hope she was desperate enough to help me. The admission hung between them, raw and uncomfortable. We're a disaster, Rosalie said. Completely, Damien agreed. But we're the only disaster we've got. Footsteps sounded from the main hall. They both straightened automatically, putting distance between each other like guilty children. A servant appeared around the corner. Mr. Blackthorne? The foreman's asking for you. Something about the south pasture fence. Tell him I'll be there shortly. Damien waited until the servant left, then turned back to Rosalie. I have to deal with ranch business. Will you be okay here? Rosalie wanted to laugh. Would she be okay trapped in a mansion full of people who hated her, pretending to be married to a stranger while investigators prepared to destroy them both? I'll manage, she said. Damien nodded and left. Rosalie stood alone in the hallway, surrounded by portraits of dead Blackthorns, and tried to figure out what the hell she was supposed to do now. The answer came in the form of Mrs. Blackthorne's cold voice from the study. Miss Mercer, if you're finished lurking in my hallway, perhaps you'd like to learn how a ranch household actually operates. Rosalie closed her eyes briefly, then walked back into the study. Mrs. Blackthorne gestured to a chair. Sit. Pay attention. I'm only explaining this once. What followed was 3 hours of brutal education. Household accounts, staff management, supply ordering, social obligations, the intricate web of relationships between neighboring ranches, and the political maneuvering required to maintain them. Mrs. Blackthorne explained it all with the enthusiasm of someone teaching a particularly slow student how to shovel manure. The Hendersons expect to call every third Sunday, she said, making a note. The Pratts host a dinner the first Friday of each month. The Wilsons are Methodists and will judge you for drinking, so smile and decline their wine with grace. The Coopers are in debt to us and will grovel accordingly. Be polite but not familiar. And the Mitchells, she paused. The Mitchells are Victor Hale's closest allies. Whatever you do, don't give them ammunition. Rosalie's head spun. How do you keep track of all this? Practice, necessity, and the understanding that in this territory, social mistakes can cost you everything. Mrs. Blackthorne closed the ledger. You'll need to attend the Ladies' Aid Society meeting on Thursday. They'll be expecting you. What's the Ladies' Aid Society? Mrs. Blackthorne's expression could have frozen water. The group of women who will spend the entire meeting tearing you apart behind polite smiles. Welcome to Frontier Society, dear. It's vicious. Thursday arrived too fast. Rosalie spent the intervening days trying to memorize names, relationships, and the 1,000 small details of running a household she'd never be qualified to run. The servants watched her with barely concealed skepticism. Damien disappeared into ranch work from dawn until dark, and when they passed each other in the house, they maintained the awkward formality of strangers playing dress-up. The only bright spot was discovering the ranch library, a small room filled with books that nobody else seemed to use. Rosalie found herself hiding there in the late afternoons, reading about Wyoming history and ranch management and anything that might help her understand the world she'd stumbled into. She was there when Damien found her on Wednesday evening. There you are, he said from the doorway. I've been looking everywhere. Rosalie looked up from a book about cattle breeding. Why? Because tomorrow you're meeting every woman in the territory who wants to destroy you, and we should probably prepare. Rosalie set the book aside. How do you prepare for that? Honestly, I have no idea. Damien came into the room and sat across from her. But my mother suggested I remind you to be charming. I'm not charming. Neither am I. He managed a tired smile. We're quite a pair. They sat in silence for a moment, the library quiet around them. Can I ask you something? Rosalie said finally. Sure. Why me? Out of everyone who might have shown up at that door, why did you choose me? Damien was quiet for a long time. You want the honest answer? Always. Because you looked desperate enough to say yes, he said. And because he hesitated. Because when you walked into that ballroom, you didn't apologize. Everyone was laughing at you, mocking you, and you just stood there like you had every right to exist in that space. I needed someone with that kind of spine. Rosalie didn't know what to say to that. Also, Damien added, you're probably the only person in Wyoming who hates Victor Hale as much as I do right now. I don't even know him. You will, and you'll hate him. The next morning, Rosalie put on the nicest of the borrowed dresses and rode into town beside Mrs. Blackthorne in a carriage that was nicer than any house Rosalie had ever lived in. Mrs. Blackthorne didn't speak the entire ride, just stared out the window with the expression of someone heading to a funeral. The Ladies' Aid Society met in a large room behind the general store. Rosalie could hear voices and laughter before they even entered. The conversation died the instant she walked in. 15 women sat arranged around tables covered in sewing projects and tea service. All of them stared, some with curiosity, some with barely disguised hostility, and at least 3 with the particular cruelty of people who'd found fresh entertainment. Mrs. Blackthorne made introductions with the warmth of someone reading a death certificate. Ladies, this is my daughter-in-law, Rosalie Blackthorne. Murmurs rippled through the room. A woman in her 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes stood. Mrs. Blackthorne, what a surprise. We'd heard rumors, of course, but this is Mrs. Cooper, Mrs. Blackthorne said to Rosalie, her voice carefully neutral. Mrs. Cooper smiled like a snake sizing up prey. Welcome to our little gathering, dear. We're so pleased to finally meet the woman who captured Damien's heart. The emphasis on finally was deliberate. Thank you, Rosalie said, keeping her voice steady. Please sit. Mrs. Cooper gestured to an empty chair positioned directly in the center of the room, the hot seat. Tell us everything. We're simply dying to know how you and Damien met. Rosalie sat, feeling every eye on her. She repeated the story they'd prepared, the church fundraiser, the orphanage, the whirlwind romance. The women listened with expressions ranging from skeptical to amused. How romantic, a younger woman said, her tone suggesting it was anything but. And you're from Philadelphia? Yes. Such a long way to travel. Your family must miss you terribly. I don't have much family, Rosalie said. Oh? Mrs. Cooper leaned forward. How tragic. And what did your father do? The question was a trap. Rosalie knew admitting her father had been a factory worker would confirm everything these women already suspected about her. He worked in manufacturing, she said carefully. Manufacturing, Mrs. Cooper repeated, making the word sound vaguely criminal. How industrious. The younger women giggled. And your mother? Another woman asked. Is she still living? No, she died when I was young. Such sadness in your past, Mrs. Cooper said with false sympathy. It's a wonder you managed to remain so optimistic. Translation, it's a wonder you managed to trap a wealthy rancher. Rosalie's hands tightened in her lap. She could feel the assessment happening, these women picking her apart piece by piece, looking for weaknesses. I understand you're a seamstress, Mrs. Cooper continued. How fortunate that Damien appreciates practical skills. I think he appreciates more than that, Rosalie said quietly. Of course. Mrs. Cooper's smile didn't reach her eyes. Though it must be quite an adjustment, going from a working girl to running a household of this magnitude. I'm learning. I'm sure. Mrs. Cooper picked up her teacup. Though between you and me, dear, these ranch marriages can be terribly complicated. So much business mixed with personal matters. I do hope you understand what you've gotten yourself into. Rosalie met her gaze directly. I understand perfectly. Do you? The question was sharp now, stripped of false kindness. Because Victor Hale is a very powerful man. and he doesn't take humiliation lightly. This isn't about Victor Hale, Rosalie said. Everything in this territory is about Victor Hale, Mrs. Cooper countered. The sooner you understand that, the better. Mrs. Blackthorne cleared her throat. Perhaps we could move on to the actual purpose of this meeting. The church social committee needs— Of course, Mrs. Cooper said, but her eyes never left Rosalie. Though I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to get to know our new friend better. After all, if the marriage is real, she'll be here for quite a while. The if hung in the air like smoke. The meeting continued, but Rosalie barely heard it. She was too focused on maintaining her composure while being systematically dissected by women who'd perfected cruelty into an art form. By the time they finally left, Rosalie felt scraped raw. That went better than expected, Mrs. Blackthorne said in the carriage. Rosalie stared at her. Better? You didn't cry, you didn't run, and you didn't give them any ammunition they didn't already have. Mrs. Blackthorne's expression softened slightly. That's a victory in this world. Rosalie leaned her head against the carriage window and watched the frontier roll past. That night she found Damien in the library, surrounded by ranch ledgers. How was it? He asked. Terrible, Rosalie said honestly. They hate me. They hate everyone. Don't take it personally. That doesn't help. Damien closed the ledger. I know. I'm sorry. Rosalie sank into a chair. Your mother said Victor Hale is investigating us. What happens when he finds proof we're lying? He won't find proof if there isn't any. Damien, I sent telegrams to Denver, he said, to Reverend Walsh, explained the situation, asked him to adjust church records if anyone comes asking. Rosalie's eyes widened. You bribed a minister? I made a generous donation to the orphanage, Damien corrected. Walsh is a practical man. He understands. That's insane. That's survival. Damien rubbed his face. Look, I know this is a mess. I know you didn't sign up for any of this. Neither did you. He laughed, bitter. I created this mess. You just got caught in it. They sat in silence for a moment. The women at the meeting, Rosalie said finally, they're terrified of Victor Hale. Everyone is. He owns half the water rights in the territory and most of the political influence. Cross him, and you lose everything. So why did you? Damien met her eyes. Because I'd rather lose everything than spend my life being someone else's property. The words hit Rosalie harder than expected. She understood that feeling, had lived it herself in Philadelphia, working in a factory that treated her like a machine, living in rooms that felt like cages. We're quite a pair, she said, echoing his words from before. Completely doomed, Damien agreed. But he was smiling when he said it, and Rosalie found herself smiling back. The weekend brought new challenges. Sunday service meant another public appearance, and Rosalie spent Saturday night memorizing the layout of the church and the names of everyone they'd sit near. Damien found her in the library again, this time pacing. You'll be fine, he said. You don't know that. I know you survived 3 weeks of travel in the Ladies' Aid Society. Church is nothing compared to that. Church is where everyone will stare at us, Rosalie pointed out, where we'll have to sit together and act like a real couple. Then we'll act. Damien hesitated. Though maybe we should practice. Practice what? Being married. He moved closer. Investigators will be watching how we interact. If we flinch every time we touch, they'll notice. Rosalie's heart rate picked up. What are you suggesting? Nothing inappropriate, Damien said quickly. Just getting comfortable. With proximity. He offered his hand. Rosalie looked at it for a long moment, then took it. His palm was warm, calloused from ranch work. Okay, Damien said. Now what? Now I have no idea, Rosalie admitted. They stood there awkwardly, holding hands like teenagers at a dance. This is ridiculous, Rosalie said. Completely. But Damien didn't let go. Though I suppose we should get used to it. They practiced small things, standing close, his hand on her back, the casual touches married people might share. It felt strange and mechanical, but Rosalie forced herself to stop flinching. By Sunday morning, she could stand beside Damien without her entire body tensing. It would have to be enough. Church was every bit the ordeal Rosalie expected. They arrived in the Blackthorne carriage to stares and whispers. Damien helped her down with exaggerated courtesy, his hand lingering on hers just long enough to be noticed. Inside, they sat in the Blackthorne family pew, front row, center position, impossible to miss. Rosalie felt eyes drilling into her back throughout the entire service. She forced herself to sit still, to sing when appropriate, to bow her head at the right moments. Beside her, Damien maintained the careful posture of a man determined to prove nothing was wrong. After the service, they were ambushed by well-wishers and the aggressively curious. "Such a lovely couple," one woman said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "When's the reception?" another asked. "Or have you already had one?" "We kept things simple," Damien said smoothly, "given the circumstances." "What circumstances?" the woman pressed. "Rosalie's family being so far away," Damien said. "It didn't seem right to have a big celebration without them." The lie rolled off his tongue so easily that Rosalie almost believed it herself. Victor Hale appeared with Margaret on his arm, both dressed in expensive black like they were attending a funeral. Margaret's eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale. "Damien," Hale said coldly. "Mrs. Blackthorne." "Victor," Damien replied with equal frost. "My investigators will be here Tuesday," Hale said. "I trust you'll make yourselves available." "Of course," Damien said. "We have nothing to hide." Hale's smile was predatory. "We'll see about that." He steered Margaret away, leaving them in a circle of openly curious onlookers. Rosalie's hands shook. She clasped them together to hide it. Damien's arm came around her waist, the first time he'd done that in public. "You okay?" he murmured. "No," Rosalie whispered back. "But I will be." Tuesday arrived like an executioner. The investigators were exactly what Rosalie expected. Two sharp-eyed men in expensive suits who looked at the world like it was full of liars waiting to be caught. They set up in the Blackthorne dining room and called Damien in first. Rosalie waited in the library, her stomach in knots. An hour passed, then two. Finally, a servant came to fetch her. The investigators sat across the table like judges at a trial. Damien sat off to the side, his expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Blackthorne," the older investigator said, "thank you for joining us. We just have a few questions." What followed was the most intense interrogation of Rosalie's life. They asked about everything: how she and Damien met, what they talked about, what she wore to the wedding, what they ate afterward, where they stayed that night, what the minister looked like, what the church smelled like, what the weather was like. Every question was a trap waiting to catch her in an inconsistency. Rosalie answered carefully, sticking to the story they'd prepared, filling in details from her imagination and praying they matched what Damien had said. "What did you have for dinner after the ceremony?" the younger investigator asked. "Chicken," Rosalie said, "at a restaurant near the church." "What was it called?" Rosalie's mind went blank. They hadn't prepared for that. "The Golden something," she said. "I'm sorry, I was nervous. It's all a bit of a blur." The investigator made a note. "And where did you stay that night?" "A hotel. She glanced at Damien, desperate. "The Palmer House," Damien supplied. "On 17th Street. The investigator's eyes narrowed. "You're helping her remember." "She's nervous," Damien said. You're interrogating my wife like she's a criminal." "If there's nothing to hide, there's nothing to be nervous about," the older investigator said. They kept going, question after question, circling back to things they'd already asked, looking for contradictions. By the time they finally dismissed her, Rosalie felt wrung out. She found Damien waiting in the hallway. "How bad was it?" she asked. "Bad," he admitted. "They know we're lying. They just can't prove it yet." "Yet," Rosalie repeated. "We'll be fine," Damien said. But he didn't sound convinced. That night, Rosalie couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the interrogation, wondering what she'd said wrong, what had given them away. She was still awake when the storm hit. Thunder cracked so loud it rattled the windows. Lightning lit up the sky in violent bursts. Rain hammered against the roof, and somewhere outside horses screamed. Rosalie bolted upright just as Damien burst through the door. "Get dressed," he said. The horses broke through the south fence. They're heading for the canyon. In this weather, lightning spooked them. He was already pulling on boots. "If they go over the edge..." He didn't finish. Didn't need to. Rosalie dressed faster than she ever had in her life and followed him downstairs. The ranch hands were already saddling horses in the barn, shouting over the storm. Mrs. Blackthorne stood in the doorway, her face pale. "Damien, You can't go out in this. We'll lose the entire herd if we don't, he shouted back. Rosalie grabbed a spare rain slicker and followed him into the storm. The rain hit like fists. Wind tore at her clothes. Lightning turned the world white and terrible. They rode hard toward the south pasture, Rosalie clinging to her horse and praying she wouldn't fall. Ahead, she could see the horses, dark shapes moving fast toward the canyon edge, panicked and mindless. The ranch hands spread out, trying to turn the herd, but the horses were too scared, too scattered. Rosalie saw it happen in pieces. A gap in the fence, a clear path straight to the drop, and one of the best breeding mares heading directly for it, eyes rolling white with fear. Nobody else was close enough to stop her. Rosalie kicked her horse forward without thinking. The animal responded, surging through the mud and darkness. She reached the mare just as it neared the canyon edge and threw herself sideways, grabbing for the halter. The mare reared. Rosalie held on, her weight dragging the animal sideways, away from the drop. They hit the ground together in a tangle of mud and hooves. Rosalie rolled, felt something crack in her ribs, tasted blood. But the mare was safe. Confused and trembling, but safe. Strong hands pulled Rosalie to her feet. Damien, soaked and wild-eyed. "Are you insane?" he shouted over the storm. "Probably," Rosalie shouted back. And then he kissed her. It was brief, fierce, tasting of rain and adrenaline and fear. When he pulled back, his eyes were different. "Don't ever do that again," he said. But he was smiling. They got the horses back, all of them, miraculously. By the time they returned to the house, dawn was breaking and everyone was soaked through. Mrs. Blackthorne took one look at Rosalie, covered in mud, favoring her ribs, grinning like an idiot, and shook her head. "You're either very brave or very stupid," she said. "Can't it be both?" Rosalie asked. And for the first time since Rosalie had arrived, Mrs. Blackthorne almost smiled. The ranch hands told the story to everyone who'd listen. The plus-size city girl who'd saved the breeding mare, who'd ridden into a lightning storm like she'd been born to it. By the end of the week, even the servants started treating Rosalie differently. Not quite with respect, but not quite with contempt either. It was a start. And when the investigators came back with more questions, Rosalie faced them with mud still under her fingernails and the memory of Damien's kiss still burning on her lips. Let them prove she was lying. She'd stopped caring whether they believed her. She had bigger things to survive now. The investigators left after 2 weeks of digging through every corner of the Blackthorne ranch, and Rosalie could finally breathe without feeling like someone was watching her count each inhale. They'd found nothing concrete, just suspicions and inconsistencies too small to build a case on. Reverend Walsh's conveniently updated church records had helped. So had the carefully maintained fiction that Rosalie and Damien performed every single day. But Victor Hale wasn't done. Not even close. The first sign came in the form of a letter delivered by messenger 3 days after the investigators departed. Mrs. Blackthorne opened it at breakfast, read 2 lines, and went pale. "What is it?" Damien asked. She handed him the letter without speaking. Rosalie watched his jaw tighten as he read. "He can't do this." "He absolutely can," Mrs. Blackthorne said quietly. "And he will." "What?" Rosalie asked. "What does it say?" Damien set the letter down carefully, like it might explode. "Victor Hale is calling in our water contract. We have 60 days to pay the full amount or lose access to the North Creek." The words meant nothing to Rosalie until she saw Mrs. Blackthorne's face. "How much?" Rosalie asked. $40,000, Mrs. Blackthorne said. "Due in full." The number hung in the air like a death sentence. "We don't have that kind of cash," Damien said. "Not liquid. Everything's tied up in livestock and land." "He knows that," Mrs. Blackthorne said. "That's the point. We either liquidate at a loss and pay him, or we lose water rights that we've relied on for 20 years. She looked at her son. "This is what you bought us when you destroyed that engagement. Victor Hale's revenge." "There has to be another option," Damien said. "There isn't." Mrs. Blackthorne stood. "I need to meet with the bank. See if they'll extend us credit." She left the dining room with the rigid posture of someone walking to an execution. Rosalie and Damien sat in silence. "I'm sorry," Rosalie said finally. "Don't be. This isn't your fault." "Isn't it? If you hadn't agreed to help me, I'd be married to Margaret Hale right now, hating every minute of my life." Damien rubbed his face. At least this way I'm being destroyed on my own terms. That's not comforting. It's not meant to be. He looked at her. You could still leave, you know. Take enough money to start somewhere else. Nobody would blame you. Rosalie thought about it, could picture herself boarding a train, disappearing into some other city, finding another factory job or boarding house, going back to the life she'd been living before Wyoming. No, she said. No? I'm not running. Rosalie met his eyes. You gave me a chance when I had nothing. I'm not abandoning you the second things get hard. Something shifted in Damien's expression. You might regret that. Probably, Rosalie said, but I'm staying anyway. That afternoon, while Damien rode out to inspect fence lines and avoid thinking about financial ruin, Rosalie found herself in the library again. She'd been studying the ranch ledgers Mrs. Blackthorne had given her, trying to understand how money and water and cattle all connected. The numbers told a story. The Blackthorne ranch was large and profitable, but most of that profit was theoretical, tied up in breeding stock and land value. Taking out loans against that value was possible, but dangerous. One bad season could turn debt into disaster, and Victor Hale controlled enough of the water supply to create that bad season whenever he wanted. Rosalie was still staring at the ledgers when Mrs. Blackthorne appeared in the doorway. Find anything useful? She asked. Just confirmation that we're trapped, Rosalie said. Mrs. Blackthorne moved to the window. Victor's been planning this for years, building leverage, buying up water rights, positioning himself so that anyone who crosses him can be destroyed with a single letter. She was quiet for a moment. I should have seen it coming. How could you? I've been playing this game since before you were born, girl. I should have known better than to let my son's happiness interfere with business. The admission surprised Rosalie. You think he's happy? I think he's less miserable than he would have been married to Margaret Hale. Mrs. Blackthorne turned from the window. Which counts for something. Rosalie wasn't sure what to say to that. The bank refused the loan, Mrs. Blackthorne continued. Said our debt-to-asset ratio is already too high. They're worried about exposure if Hale decides to squeeze harder. So what do we do? I don't know yet. Mrs. Blackthorne's voice was flat. But I'm open to suggestions. Rosalie looked back at the ledgers, at the web of contracts and relationships that kept the ranch running. An idea started forming, half wild, probably impossible, but better than nothing. What if we don't fight him alone? Rosalie said slowly. What? Victor Hale has power because he's consolidated control. Water rights, land, contracts. But there are other ranches, aren't there? Smaller ones. People who probably hate him as much as we do but can't stand up to him individually. Mrs. Blackthorne's eyes narrowed. Go on. What if we organize them? Pool resources, share water access, create enough collective power that Hale can't pick us off one by one. A rancher's cooperative, Mrs. Blackthorne said. It's been tried before. Failed spectacularly. Why? Because ranchers are stubborn, territorial, and generally hate working together. Mrs. Blackthorne paused. But that was before Victor Hale got quite this aggressive. Desperation changes people. So it's possible? Possible and likely are very different things. Mrs. Blackthorne studied Rosalie with an expression that was almost respect. But it's more of a plan than I had 5 minutes ago. That night at dinner, Rosalie laid out the idea to Damien. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. You want to unite the territory's ranchers, he said when she finished. The same ranchers who've been feuding with each other since before Wyoming was a state. I want to give them a reason to stop feuding, Rosalie corrected. Survival is a pretty good motivator. It's insane. So is letting Victor Hale destroy us without fighting back. Damien was quiet for a long moment. You'd need to convince them, face to face, and most of them won't take you seriously. Because I'm a woman? Because you're an outsider who's been here less than a month and married under suspicious circumstances. He met her eyes. But if we could pull it off, we'd have a chance, Rosalie finished. A small one, Damien said. But yeah, a chance. They started with the Hendersons because Mrs. Blackthorne said they were reasonable people who owed the Blackthornes a favor from 5 years back. Rosalie and Damien rode out on a cold November morning that promised snow by evening. The Henderson ranch was smaller than the Blackthorne estate, but well maintained. Mr. Henderson met them at the door with the wary hospitality of a man expecting bad news. Damien, Mrs. Blackthorne. He nodded to each of them. What brings you out this way? A proposition, Damien said. Can we come in? Henderson's wife served coffee while Damien explained the situation. Rosalie watched their faces carefully, trying to read how the idea was landing. You want us to throw in with you against Victor Hale, Henderson said when Damien finished. That's what this is. We want to create a system where Hale can't control everything, Rosalie said. There's a difference. Not to Victor Hale, there isn't. Henderson shook his head. You go against him, you lose. That's how it works in this territory. Only because everyone's too scared to stand together, Rosalie said. Scared? Mrs. Henderson spoke for the first time. Try practical. We've got 3 kids and a mortgage. Can't afford to pick fights with powerful men. You can't afford not to, Rosalie countered. Hale's calling in the Blackthorne water contract right now. What's stopping him from doing the same to you next month? Or next year? How long before he owns every creek and well in Wyoming? The question hung in the air. Henderson looked at his wife, some silent conversation passing between them. Even if we wanted to help, he said finally, we don't have capital to contribute. Can barely make our own payments most months. We're not asking for money, Damien said. We're asking for cooperation, shared water access, collective bargaining power, a united front. And if it fails? Then we're no worse off than we are now, Rosalie said, which wasn't quite true but sounded better than admitting they'd all be destroyed together. Henderson was quiet for a long moment. Let me think about it. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. They visited 8 ranches over the next 2 weeks, got 2 firm rejections, 3 maybes, and 3 tentative agreements to at least hear more. It was progress, barely, but every conversation felt like pushing a boulder uphill. The worst was the Pratts, who listened to the entire pitch and then laughed in their faces. You think a bunch of small ranchers can take on Victor Hale, Mr. Pratt said. Sweetheart, Hale's been running this territory since before you were born. Then maybe it's time someone else had a turn, Rosalie said. Pratt's expression hardened. You don't know what you're talking about. Go back to your husband's ranch and let the men handle business. Damien's hand tightened on Rosalie's arm, warning her to let it go. But Rosalie was done being dismissed. I know you're scared. I know standing up to Hale feels impossible. But rolling over and letting him control everything isn't the same as handling business. It's just giving up with extra steps. Get out, Pratt said flatly. They left. In the wagon, Damien was quiet for a long time. I shouldn't have said that, Rosalie said finally. No, you absolutely should have. Damien looked at her. Pratt's an ass. But you're right. He's scared. They all are. Fear doesn't help us build a coalition. No, but anger might. Damien urged the horses faster. The Mitchells are next. They're Hale's allies, but their contract is up for renewal soon. If we can convince them that Hale's grip is weakening, they might switch sides, Rosalie finished. Worth a shot. The Mitchell Ranch was the largest they'd visited aside from the Blackthorne estate. Everything about it screamed money. The house, the outbuildings, the quality of the livestock. Mrs. Mitchell received them in a parlor that looked like something out of a magazine. She was younger than Rosalie expected, maybe 40, with the kind of beauty that came from never having to worry about anything. This is unexpected, she said, settling into a chair with the grace of someone who'd never sat awkwardly in her life. I heard about your little, crusade. Didn't think you'd be bold enough to come here. We're visiting everyone? Damien said. Everyone except the Hales, I imagine. Mrs. Mitchell smiled. Victor's been quite vocal about your situation. Such a scandal. Is that what he calls it? Rosalie asked. Among other things. Mrs. Mitchell's eyes traveled over Rosalie with the assessment of someone pricing livestock. Though I must say, you're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone more conventional. If Damien was going to throw away his future, I assumed it would be for someone who looked the part. The insult was delivered so smoothly that it took Rosalie a second to register it. Damien's voice went cold. We didn't come here to discuss my wife's appearance. Of course not. You came to convince me to betray Victor Hale. Mrs. Mitchell poured herself tea with deliberate slowness. which is either very brave or very stupid. We came to offer you an alternative, Rosalie said, refusing to let the woman rattle her, before Hale's control becomes absolute. His control is already absolute, dear. That's rather the point. Not if enough people refuse to play his game. Mrs. Mitchell laughed. You really don't understand how this works, do you? Victor Hale doesn't play games he can lose. Every contract, every alliance, every move he makes is calculated to ensure his position. Going against him isn't brave. It's suicide. Then why are you listening? Rosalie asked. Mrs. Mitchell's smile faltered slightly. Excuse me? If refusing Hale is suicide, why let us in the door? Why hear us out? Rosalie leaned forward. Unless maybe you're not quite as confident in his invincibility as you're pretending. The parlor went very quiet. I think this conversation is over, Mrs. Mitchell said. Your contract renewal is in 6 months, Damien said. What's Hale asking for this time? 10% increase? 20? How long before you're paying him more than you're making? Mrs. Mitchell stood. You should leave. Think about it, Rosalie said as Damien guided her toward the door. We'll be here when you're ready to talk. Outside, Damien let out a breath. That went well. She's scared, Rosalie said, which means we got to her. Or we just made an enemy. She was already an enemy. At least now she knows we're serious. They made it back to the Blackthorne ranch as snow started falling. Mrs. Blackthorne was waiting in the study with a ledger open and an expression that meant bad news. The bank sent another letter, she said without preamble. They're calling in a smaller loan we took out 2 years ago. Want it paid in 30 days. Can we do it? Damien asked. Not without selling livestock at a loss, which is exactly what they're counting on. Mrs. Blackthorne closed the ledger. Hale's putting pressure on everyone who does business with us. The bank, our suppliers, even the railroad. He's trying to strangle us economically before the water deadline even hits. How much time do we have? Rosalie asked. On the water contract, 42 days. On the bank loan, 28. On everything else? Mrs. Blackthorne's laugh was bitter. However long it takes Victor Hale to decide he's made his point. Rosalie thought about the ranchers they'd visited, the fear in their eyes, the careful calculations of people trying to decide if fighting back was worth the risk. We need to accelerate this, she said. Get commitments now instead of waiting for people to come around. How? Damien asked. Most of them are still deciding. Then we force the decision. Rosalie looked at Mrs. Blackthorne. Do we have enough cash to host a gathering? Something big enough to get everyone in the same room? Mrs. Blackthorne's eyebrow lifted. You want to throw a party while we're going bankrupt? I want to create a moment, Rosalie said. Put everyone face to face and make them choose sides publicly. That's risky, Mrs. Blackthorne said. If they choose Hale, we're finished. We're finished anyway if we don't try. Mrs. Blackthorne considered this. We could do a winter social, cover it as a normal seasonal gathering. People would come out of curiosity if nothing else. How fast can we organize it? Damien asked. A week, maybe less if we cut corners. Mrs. Blackthorne looked at Rosalie. You understand this could blow up in our faces? Everything could blow up in our faces, Rosalie said. This way we control the explosion. Mrs. Blackthorne actually smiled. I'm starting to see why my son married you. The next week passed in a blur of preparation. Invitations went out to every ranch within a day's travel. The house was cleaned, supplies ordered, and Rosalie spent more time than she wanted to admit worrying about what to wear. It doesn't matter what you wear, Damien said when he found her staring at dresses the night before the gathering. It absolutely matters, Rosalie said. These people already think I don't belong here. If I show up looking poor or inappropriate, you'll look fine, Damien interrupted. You always do. Rosalie turned to look at him. That's the nicest thing you've said to me. Don't get used to it. But he was smiling when he said it, and Rosalie found herself smiling back. The night of the gathering, 37 people showed up, more than expected, but fewer than hoped for. Rosalie greeted them at the door beside Damien and Mrs. Blackthorne, playing the role of gracious hostess while her stomach churned. The Hendersons came. The Pratts didn't. The Mitchells sent regrets, which felt like a statement in itself. By 8 o'clock, the main hall was full of ranchers and their wives drinking punch and making polite conversation while carefully avoiding the topic everyone was thinking about. Rosalie watched them from the edge of the room, trying to figure out how to turn small talk into revolution. Mrs. Cooper from the Ladies' Aid Society appeared at her elbow. Quite the turnout, though I noticed some notable absences. People are busy, Rosalie said neutrally. Or scared. Mrs. Cooper sipped her punch. Victor Hale made it very clear he'd remember who attended tonight. And yet you're here. I'm old and my husband's dead. Hale can't touch me. Mrs. Cooper studied Rosalie. But these others? They're risking everything just by being in this room. I know, Rosalie said quietly. Do you? Mrs. Cooper's expression sharpened. You're playing with people's livelihoods, their homes, their children's futures. I hope whatever you're planning is worth it. Before Rosalie could respond, Damien stepped to the center of the room and raised his voice. Thank you all for coming tonight. I know it's not easy to get away this time of year, and some of you took risks just being here. I appreciate it. The room quieted, everyone turning to face him. I'm not going to pretend this is just a social gathering, Damien continued. We all know why we're here. Victor Hale is tightening his grip on this territory, and if we don't do something about it, he'll strangle us all eventually. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Henderson stepped forward. What exactly are you proposing, Damien? A cooperative, Damien said. Shared water rights, collective bargaining, unified resistance to Hale's monopoly. We're stronger together than we are separately. And if Hale retaliates, someone called out. He's already retaliating, Rosalie said, moving to stand beside Damien. The question is whether you want to face it alone or with allies. Pratt pushed through the crowd. This is insanity. You're asking us to commit economic suicide. I'm asking you to stop letting Victor Hale dictate your future, Rosalie shot back. There's a difference. You've been here, what, a month? You don't know anything about this territory or how things work. I know what it's like to be controlled, Rosalie interrupted. To work for people who treat you like property. To watch everything you build get taken away because someone more powerful decided they wanted it. I know exactly how this works. The room went quiet. My wife's right, Damien said. We can keep playing Hale's game and hoping he shows mercy, or we can change the rules. Build something he can't control. It won't work, Pratt said. He'll destroy you. All of you. Maybe, Rosalie agreed, but at least we'll go down fighting instead of begging. Henderson looked around the room. Show of hands. Who's willing to at least discuss the details? Slowly, hands started going up. Not all of them. Not even most. But enough. 15 ranchers. 15 small operations that together controlled maybe a quarter of the territory's water access and half its independent grazing land. It wasn't much, but it was something. We'll need a formal agreement, Henderson said. Legal documents. Clear terms. We'll draft them, Mrs. Blackthorne said. Have them ready within a week. Pratt shook his head and left, taking 3 other ranchers with him, but the rest stayed. They talked until midnight, working out the rough framework of an alliance. Shared water access in exchange for shared costs. Collective purchasing power. A promise to stand together if Hale targeted any individual member. By the time the last guest left, Rosalie was exhausted but buzzing with something that felt like hope. We did it, she said to Damien in the empty hallway. We started it, he corrected. The hard part comes next. He was right. Within 3 days, Victor Hale had heard about the gathering and responded with predictable fury. He bought out the contracts of 2 ranchers who'd attended, forcing them to sell at a loss. He raised rates on another 3, and he sent Damien a letter that was more threat than communication. But the cooperative held. The 15 ranchers met again, this time with lawyers, and signed a formal agreement. Water rights were pooled, costs shared. And for the first time since Hale had started his consolidation, a group of ranchers had something that looked like leverage. Word spread across the territory. Some people called them heroes. Others called them fools. The newspapers picked up the story, turning it into frontier drama. Local ranchers defy cattle baron, read one headline. Another went with marriage scandal turns into territory war. Rosalie's name appeared in print for the first time in her life, described variously as the controversial Mrs. Blackthorne, the mysterious Eastern bride, and in one particularly vicious editorial, the plus-size opportunist who seduced her way into Wyoming's largest ranch. She tried not to read them, failed consistently. Don't, Damien said when he caught her with a newspaper one afternoon. They're trying to make you feel small. They're succeeding. Only if you let them. He took the paper from her hands. You organized 15 independent ranchers into a functional alliance in less than a month. Hale's scared of you. That's why he's attacking. Hale's not scared of anyone. He's scared of you, Damien repeated, because you're the one thing he didn't plan for. Rosalie wanted to believe him, wanted to feel powerful instead of exposed. But that night, someone threw a rock through one of the ranch windows with a note attached. Go back east where you belong. The window was fixed by morning. The note went in the fire. But the message was clear. Not everyone in the territory appreciated what Rosalie was trying to build. The deadline for the water contract payment was 23 days away when Mrs. Mitchell showed up unannounced at the ranch. Rosalie found her in the parlor looking perfectly composed despite having ridden through a snowstorm. Mrs. Mitchell, Rosalie said carefully, this is unexpected. I'm sure it is. Mrs. Mitchell removed her gloves with deliberate precision. I've come to discuss your cooperative. We already tried that conversation, and now I'm ready to have it again. Mrs. Mitchell met Rosalie's eyes. Victor Hale raised my contract renewal rate by 30%, said it was market adjustment. We both know what it really is. Punishment for listening to us, Rosalie said. Exactly. Mrs. Mitchell's composure cracked slightly. I have a choice. Pay as extortion or join your alliance. Neither option is appealing, but at least your alliance has the virtue of telling Hale to go to hell. Rosalie felt something shift. You want in. I want options, and you're offering the only ones I've got. Mrs. Mitchell stood. So yes, I'm in, on one condition. What condition? I want a seat at the decision-making table, not as a junior partner, as an equal. Rosalie considered this. The Mitchell Ranch was 3 times the size of most of the cooperative members. Having them would shift the balance significantly. I'll talk to the others, Rosalie said, but I think we can make that work. Mrs. Mitchell nodded and headed for the door, then paused. I underestimated you. I won't make that mistake again. After she left, Damien appeared in the doorway. Did that just happen? I think we just got our first major defection from Hale's camp, Rosalie said. One down, Damien said, but about 15 more to go before we're actually competitive. But he was grinning when he said it, and Rosalie felt that dangerous flutter of hope again. The cooperative grew. Slowly at first, then faster as more ranchers saw that Hale's retaliation wasn't quite as devastating as they'd feared. Shared water access meant the Blackthorne survived his contract termination. Collective purchasing meant smaller ranches could afford supplies they couldn't access individually. By the time the original water deadline passed, they had 23 members. Not enough to control the territory, but enough to be a problem. Hale responded by filing legal challenges, claimed the water-sharing agreement violated existing contracts, brought in lawyers from Denver to pick apart every line of their cooperative charter. Mrs. Blackthorne met each challenge with lawyers of her own, draining the ranch's remaining cash reserves to fund a legal battle that looked increasingly like a war of attrition. We're bleeding money, she told Rosalie and Damien one night. Even with the cooperative helping, we can't sustain this pace much longer. How long do we have? Damien asked. 3 months? Maybe 4 if we're lucky. Mrs. Blackthorne looked exhausted. After that, we're out of options. Rosalie stared at the ledgers, willing them to reveal some solution they'd missed. What if we go public? She said finally. Both Blackthorns looked at her. Public how? Mrs. Blackthorne asked. Press coverage. Make this about more than just ranch politics. Frame it as a fight against monopoly power. Get newspapers in Denver and San Francisco interested. Rosalie warmed to the idea as she spoke. Hale's been operating in the shadows, using contracts and quiet pressure. What if we drag it all into the light? That's risky, Damien said. If the press sides with Hale, then we're no worse off than we are now, Rosalie interrupted. But if they don't, if we can turn this into a David and Goliath story. Mrs. Blackthorne was quiet for a long moment. It might work. The frontier loves an underdog story. It might also backfire spectacularly, Damien pointed out. Everything we've done so far could backfire, Rosalie said. This way, we control the narrative instead of letting Hale write it. They sent letters to 3 major newspapers the next day. 2 never responded. But the third, a San Francisco paper known for muckraking journalism, sent a reporter within the week. His name was James Fletcher, and he looked like he'd never been west of St. Louis. Expensive suit, soft hands, notebook full of assumptions about frontier life. But his questions were sharp, and his eyes were shrewd. "Tell me about Victor Hale," he said to Rosalie over coffee in the Blackthorne parlor. Rosalie laid it out. The water contracts. The intimidation. The systematic consolidation of power designed to eliminate competition. Fletcher took notes without comment. "And your cooperative is the resistance to this?" he asked. "We're an alternative," Rosalie corrected, "a way for smaller ranchers to survive without surrendering control to one man." "Some people say you're just bitter about a failed engagement," Fletcher said mildly, "that this is personal, not political." "It's both," Rosalie said, "but that doesn't make it wrong." Fletcher smiled. "Fair enough. Can I speak with some of your cooperative members?" "All of them, if you want." He spent 2 weeks in the territory, interviewing ranchers, examining contracts, and digging into Hale's business practices with the thoroughness of someone who smelled a major story. When he finally left, Rosalie had no idea what he'd write. They found out 6 weeks later when the article appeared on the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle under the headline, "The Cattle Baron and the Seamstress, How One Woman's Fight Could Break a Wyoming Monopoly." The article was devastating. Fletcher had documented every questionable contract, every instance of intimidation, every way Hale had bent the law to consolidate power. He'd interviewed ranchers who were too scared to speak publicly but willing to talk to a journalist. And he'd framed the whole thing as a battle between corporate greed and frontier independence. Rosalie came off as something between a hero and a curiosity. The unlikely champion of Wyoming's small ranchers, whose plus-size figure and working-class background make her an unusual leader in a territory dominated by masculine power. She wasn't sure how to feel about that, but the article's impact was undeniable. Within days, it was picked up by papers across the West. People who'd never heard of the cooperative were suddenly writing letters of support. A lawyer from Denver offered pro bono services. 3 more ranchers joined the alliance. And Victor Hale, for the first time since Rosalie had arrived in Wyoming, looked genuinely rattled. She saw him at the general store 2 weeks after the article ran. He stared at her across the crowded space with an expression that was pure fury mixed with something that might have been grudging respect. "Mrs. Blackthorne," he said coldly. "Mr. Hale," Rosalie replied with equal frost. They stood in silence for a moment, 2 people on opposite sides of a war neither had expected. "This isn't over," Hale said finally. "I know," Rosalie said, "but we're not backing down." Hale's jaw tightened. "You should have stayed in Philadelphia." "Probably," Rosalie agreed, "but I'm here now." He left without another word. That night, Damien found Rosalie in the library staring at a map of the territory with colored pins marking cooperative members. "Thinking about strategy?" he asked. "Thinking about how far we've come," Rosalie said, "and how far we still have to go." Damien moved to stand beside her. "Fletcher's article helped, but Hale's not done. He'll find another way to come at us." "Let him." Rosalie turned to face him. "We're ready." Damien looked at her like he was seeing someone completely different from the woman who'd stumbled into his engagement party 2 months ago. "What?" Rosalie asked. "Nothing, just—" He paused. "You're remarkable. You know that?" Rosalie felt heat rise in her face. "I'm just trying to survive." "No," Damien said quietly. "You're doing a lot more than that." They stood close enough that Rosalie could count his heartbeats, close enough that kissing him would be easy. She didn't move. Neither did he. The moment stretched, fragile and electric. Then footsteps sounded in the hallway, and they stepped apart like guilty teenagers. Mrs. Blackthorne appeared in the doorway. "We have a problem. Victor Hale just filed criminal fraud charges against both of you. Claims the marriage was fabricated to manipulate contracts and defraud his family." The words hit like a physical blow. "He can't prove that," Damien said. "He doesn't have to prove it," Mrs. Blackthorne said grimly. "Just making the accusation is enough to tie us up in court for months. Maybe years." Rosalie felt the room spin slightly. "When?" "Trial's scheduled for 6 weeks from now." Mrs. Blackthorne's voice was flat. "If he wins, you both face prison time, and the cooperative collapses without leadership. Everything they'd built. everything they'd fought for, about to be destroyed by a man who couldn't stand losing. Then we don't lose, Rosalie said. It's not that simple. Yes, it is. Rosalie's voice was hard. We tell the truth, we defend ourselves, and we make damn sure Victor Hale regrets starting this fight. Mrs. Blackthorne looked at her for a long moment. You understand what's at stake? Everything, Rosalie said. Same as it's been since the day I walked through your door. Then we'd better get a very good lawyer, Mrs. Blackthorne said. And the war that had been building since that first night in the ballroom finally, inevitably, exploded into the open. The lawyer Mrs. Blackthorne hired was a sharp-eyed woman from Denver named Catherine Price, who charged twice what any man would and was worth every penny. She arrived at the ranch 3 days after the fraud charges were filed, carrying a leather case and an expression that suggested she'd seen worse scandals in one. Tell me everything, she said the moment introductions were finished. And I mean everything. The lies, the truth, the parts you're ashamed of. I can't defend you if I don't know what I'm working with. They sat in the study for 6 hours while Rosalie and Damien laid out the whole mess. The fake marriage announcement, the bribed minister, the invented backstory, all of it. Price took notes without judgment, occasionally asking questions that made Rosalie's stomach churn. So the marriage certificate is legitimate, Price said when they finished. You actually got married after the announcement. We had to, Damien said. Once I claimed we were married, we needed documentation. When exactly did this happen? 2 weeks after the engagement party, Rosalie said. We rode to Denver and found a minister willing to marry us for real. Price made a note. So you've been legally married for approximately 2 months. Yes. And consummated the marriage. Rosalie felt her face burn. That's not... We haven't... It's complicated. It's actually very simple, Price said bluntly. Fraud cases hinge on intent. If you got married with the intention of creating a legal union, even under unconventional circumstances, that's different from fabricating a marriage that never happened. The consummation question matters because it speaks to whether you're living as husband and wife or maintaining a charade. Damien's jaw tightened. We're living in the same house, sharing the same space. But not the same bed, Price said, reading between the lines, which Hale's lawyers will use to argue the marriage isn't genuine. We sleep in the same room, Rosalie said quietly. Have since the first night. He takes the floors. Price looked between them with an expression that was almost sympathetic. I'm not judging your personal arrangements, but I need you to understand how this will look in court. Victor Hale is going to paint you as con artist who staged a marriage to escape his daughter's engagement. Every unconventional detail becomes evidence. So what do we do? Damien asked. We pivot, Price said. Stop defending the circumstances of how you married and start defending why you married. Hale wants to make this about fraud. We make it about freedom. 2 people choosing each other over an arranged marriage that benefited everyone except them. That's basically admitting I lied, Damien said. You did lie, Price said flatly. The question is whether the lie constitutes criminal fraud or justifiable desperation. I can work with desperation. It's humanizing. Everyone understands wanting to escape a trap. Rosalie studied the lawyer. You think we can win? I think we can make it close enough that Hale might settle rather than risk losing publicly, Price said. But I need you both to be completely honest on the stand. No more invented stories, no carefully crafted fictions. The truth, messy as it is our best weapon. The next 6 weeks were a nightmare of preparation. Price drilled them on testimony until Rosalie could recite her story in her sleep. They went over every detail of the night they'd met, the decision to marry, the months that followed. Price pulled apart inconsistencies, challenged weak spots, and forced them to confront parts of the story they'd been avoiding. Why did you say yes? Price asked Rosalie during one particularly brutal practice session. You could have walked away, could have found another solution. Why agree to marry a stranger? Rosalie had answered this question a dozen times, but Price kept pushing. Because I had nowhere else to go, Rosalie said. Not good enough. Hale's prosecutor will tear that apart. Try again. Because I was desperate. Still not good enough. What made you desperate enough to risk everything? Rosalie felt something crack open inside her chest. Because I was tired of being powerless. Tired of people like Victor Hale deciding my future without asking. Tired of being discarded the second I stopped being useful. Her voice shook. Damien offered me a choice when I hadn't had one in years. That's why I said yes. Price nodded slowly. That. Say exactly that on the stand. The trial date arrived like an execution. The courthouse in town was packed, standing room only, people crowding the hallways just to catch a glimpse of the scandal. Reporters filled the front rows. The cooperative ranchers came in force, wearing their best clothes like armor. And Victor Hale sat with his lawyers at the prosecution table, looking like a man who'd already won. Margaret was there too, sitting behind her father, her face pale and pinched. She didn't look at Damien once. Judge Morrison, a weathered man in his 60s who'd been presiding over Wyoming territorial cases since before Rosalie was born, called the court to order with a gavel strike that silenced the room. "We're here regarding the territory's fraud case against Damien and Rosalie Blackthorne," he said. "Prosecution, your opening statement." Hale's lead attorney was a man named Sullivan, silver-haired, expensive suit, the kind of lawyer who made intimidation look like courtesy. He stood and addressed the jury with the confidence of someone who'd never lost. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a simple case of deception and fraud. The defendants fabricated a marriage to escape legal obligations and defraud my client's family. On the night of September 20th, Damien Blackthorne was engaged to Margaret Hale. A formal contract had been signed, arrangements made. Then this woman," he gestured at Rosalie like she was evidence, "appeared, and suddenly Mr. Blackthorne claims to have been secretly married for months. But there's no evidence of this prior marriage. No witnesses who saw them together before that night. No documentation that hasn't been conveniently produced after the fact. What we have is a desperate man and an opportunistic woman who invented a marriage to steal what rightfully belonged to the Hale family." Sullivan spoke for 20 minutes, building a narrative of calculated deception. By the time he sat down, half the jury looked ready to convict. Catherine Price stood slowly. She didn't have Sullivan's polish or theatrical presence, but her voice carried weight. "Mr. Sullivan wants you to see fraud where there's actually something much simpler. Two people refusing to be sold like cattle. Yes, Damien Blackthorne was engaged to Margaret Hale. Yes, that engagement was arranged by his mother and Mr. Hale for business purposes, not love. And yes, when faced with a future he didn't choose, Damien made a desperate decision." She paused. "Desperate, not criminal. He met Rosalie Mercer when she arrived seeking employment. They married quickly, unconventionally, because both of them understood what it meant to have your life controlled by more powerful people. That's not fraud. That's survival." The jury looked less certain now. "The prosecution will show you contracts and business arrangements," Price continued. "They'll argue about proper procedures and legal obligations. But at the heart of this case is a simple question. Do people have the right to choose their own marriages, or can they be forced into unions that serve everyone except themselves? I believe you'll conclude that Damien and Rosalie Blackthorne, whatever mistakes they made, did not commit fraud. They committed the much smaller crime of wanting freedom." She sat down. Judge Morrison nodded to Sullivan. "Call your first witness." The prosecution built their case methodically. They called the investigators who'd found inconsistencies in Rosalie and Damien's story. They called guests from the engagement party who testified about the shock of that night. They brought in a handwriting expert who questioned whether some of the earlier documentation had been altered. And then they called Margaret Hale. She walked to the witness stand like someone heading to a funeral, her hands trembling as she placed them on the Bible for swearing in. Sullivan approached her gently. "Miss Hale, can you describe your relationship with Damien Blackthorne prior to September 20th? Margaret's voice was barely audible. "We were engaged. Had been for 3 months." "And did Mr. Blackthorne give you any indication that he was already married?" "No, never." "Did he seem reluctant about the engagement?" Margaret hesitated. "Sometimes, but I thought he was just nervous." "And the night of the party, when he announced his marriage to the defendant, what was your reaction?" "I was devastated." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I loved him. I thought we were building a life together." Rosalie felt a twist of guilt watching the girl cry. Whatever else was true, Margaret had been hurt by their choices. Margaret had. Sullivan pressed his advantage. "Did you have any knowledge of Rosalie Mercer before that night?" "No, I'd never heard her name." "So as far as you knew, Mr. Blackthorne was free to marry you?" "Yes." "Thank you, Miss Hale. No further questions." Catherine Price stood for cross-examination. Her expression was sympathetic but firm. Miss Hale, I'm sorry for your pain, truly, but I need to ask you some difficult questions. Margaret nodded, wiping her eyes. When your father arranged this engagement with Mrs. Blackthorne, Damien's mother, were you consulted? What do you mean? Did anyone ask if you wanted to marry Damien Blackthorne, or was it decided by your father and his mother? Margaret's face flushed. It was discussed as a family. That's not what I asked. Did you have a choice? Sullivan stood. Objection, relevance. Goes to the nature of the engagement contract, Price said, whether it was a mutual agreement or an arrangement imposed on both parties. Overruled, Morrison said. Answer the question, Miss Hale. Margaret's voice was small. My father said it was a good match, that it would secure our family's position. So you didn't choose Damien. You were told to marry him. It's not that simple. Actually, it is, Price said, not unkindly. Both you and Mr. Blackthorne were being used as bargaining chips in your parents' business dealings. The difference is he found a way out and you didn't. I'm sorry you were hurt, but that doesn't make his marriage fraud. Margaret left the stand looking smaller than when she'd arrived. The prosecution continued through the afternoon. More witnesses, more documentation, building a case that looked damning on paper. But Price chipped away at it. She got the investigators to admit they'd found no evidence the marriage certificate was forged. She got the handwriting expert to concede that the documents could be legitimate. She forced witness after witness to acknowledge that while the marriage was unconventional, there was no proof it was fabricated. By the end of the first day, the certainty in the jury's faces had cracked. The second day started with Damien taking the stand. Sullivan approached him like a predator circling wounded prey. Mr. Blackthorne, you were engaged to Margaret Hale, correct? Yes. And you signed a formal contract to that effect? My mother signed it. I was there. But you didn't object at the time. No. When did you first meet Rosalie Mercer? The night of the engagement party, September 20th. Sullivan's eyes gleamed. So, you'd like this court to believe that you met a complete stranger and immediately decided to claim her as your wife to escape your engagement? That's exactly what happened, Damien said calmly. You expect us to believe you married someone you'd known for less than an hour? We married 2 weeks later, after I'd gotten to know her. Sullivan pounced. So you lied that night. You told everyone she was your wife when she wasn't. Damien met his eyes steadily. Yes, I lied. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Price sat very still, trusting the strategy they'd practiced. Sullivan smiled. So you admit to fraud? I admit to lying, Damien said. Not fraud. I lied because I was desperate and cornered and saw one chance to escape a marriage I didn't want. Then I made that lie true as fast as I could. By bribing a minister? By making a generous donation to a church that needed it and asking for discreet service. That's corruption. That's frontier pragmatism, Damien shot back. I did what I had to do to marry the woman I chose instead of the woman I was sold to. Sullivan's expression hardened. You claim to have chosen Mrs. Blackthorne, but you didn't know her. You'd met her once under chaotic circumstances. What exactly did you choose? Her appearance? Her charm? The emphasis on appearance was deliberate, cruel. I chose her courage, Damien said quietly. Everyone at that party was mocking her, treating her like she was worthless because she didn't look like what they expected. And she stood there anyway. Didn't apologize for existing, didn't collapse under their judgment. I needed someone with that kind of spine if I was going to survive what came next. Sullivan paused, clearly not expecting that answer. And you expect this court to believe that was enough basis for marriage? I expect this court to understand that I married Rosalie because she was the only person in that entire house who understood what it felt like to be trapped. Damien's voice strengthened. We made an unconventional choice under desperate circumstances, but we made it together, and we've lived it together ever since. That's not fraud. That's marriage. Price stood for redirect. Mr. Blackthorne, in the months since you married Rosalie, have you regretted the decision? Damien looked directly at Rosalie for the first time since taking the stand. Not once. Why not? Because she's the strongest person I've ever met. Because she turned a desperate lie into something real. Because she looked at a territory full of people who wanted her gone, and decided to stay anyway. He paused. I didn't choose her for convenience or strategy. I chose her because she was worth choosing. The courtroom was silent. Price nodded. No further questions. When the prosecution rested, Price called Rosalie to the stand. Walking up there felt like walking through water. Every eye in the courtroom followed her, and Rosalie could feel their judgments like weight. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Price approached with the expression of someone about to gamble everything. Mrs. Blackthorne, why did you come to Wyoming? For a job, Rosalie said. I answered an advertisement for a seamstress position at a ranch. And when you arrived, what did you find? An engagement party, wealthy people in a beautiful house, and absolutely no job waiting for me. What did you do? I walked into the ballroom by accident. Then I stood there while everyone laughed at me. Why didn't you leave? The question hung in the air. Rosalie thought about all the prepared answers they'd practiced, but Price had told her to be honest. Because I was tired of running, Rosalie said quietly. I'd spent my whole life being told I didn't belong places because of how I looked or where I came from, and I was just tired. So when everyone stared at me like I was garbage, some stubborn part of me refused to give them the satisfaction of watching me leave. And when Damien claimed you as his wife, I thought he was insane. A small laugh escaped. I mean, he was insane, we both were. But he offered me a choice, pretend to be his wife and have safety, or walk back out into the cold with nowhere to go. I chose safety. Some would call that opportunistic. Some would be right, Rosalie said. I was desperate and broke and out of options. If that's opportunistic, then yes. I took the opportunity he offered. But you stayed, Price said. Even after the immediate danger passed, even after you could have left. Why? Rosalie looked at Damien, at Mrs. Blackthorne sitting in the gallery, at the cooperative members who'd come to support them. Because somewhere between pretending to be married and actually being married, I stopped running. I started building something, the cooperative, the alliances, a life that meant something more than just surviving. She turned back to Price. I stayed because for the first time in my life, I had a reason to. Price nodded. Thank you. Your witness, Mr. Sullivan? Sullivan approached like a shark who'd spotted blood. Mrs. Blackthorne, or should I say Miss Mercer, you admit you married Mr. Blackthorne for money and safety. I married him because I had no other choice, Rosalie corrected. There's a difference. Is there? You saw a wealthy man and an opportunity. You took it. I saw a desperate man and a mutual need. We helped each other. By defrauding my client's family. By refusing to be pieces in your client's business deals, Rosalie shot back. Victor Hale didn't care about his daughter's happiness any more than Mrs. Blackthorne cared about her son's. They wanted a merger. Damien and I wanted lives we could choose. Sullivan's expression hardened. You expect this jury to believe that a woman of your background and appearance could inspire genuine devotion from someone like Damien Blackthorne? The courtroom went very quiet. Rosalie felt the familiar burn of humiliation rising but pushed it down. I expect this jury to understand that worth isn't determined by appearance or background. I expect them to see that two people can choose each other for reasons that have nothing to do with money or status or what society thinks is appropriate. That's a lovely sentiment, Sullivan said coldly, but it doesn't change the fact that you fabricated a marriage to steal what belonged to the Hale family. I didn't steal anything, Rosalie said, her voice steady. Margaret Hale didn't own Damien. Neither did her father. You can't steal a person who was never property to begin with. Sullivan opened his mouth for another attack, but Price objected. The prosecution is badgering the witness, she said. Sustained, Morrison said. Move on, Mr. Sullivan. Sullivan tried several more angles, but Rosalie held firm. She admitted to the desperate circumstances, acknowledged the unconventional marriage, refused to apologize for surviving. By the time she left the stand, she was shaking but unbroken. The trial continued for 3 more days, character witnesses on both sides, expert testimony about contract law, endless arguments about intent and legitimacy. Then came the moment that changed everything. Price called Damien back to the stand for additional testimony. Sullivan had been hammering the point that the marriage couldn't be genuine because it was founded on deception. Price addressed it head on. Mr. Blackthorne, I need to ask you something difficult. Did you pay witnesses to support your story about the marriage? The courtroom held its breath. Damien looked at Price, then at Rosalie, then at the jury. Yes. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Sullivan leaned forward with predatory interest. Can you explain? Price asked calmly. After the engagement party, Rosalie and I needed to make our story believable. I contacted Reverend Walsh and asked him to backdate our marriage certificate. I also paid 2 people from his congregation to claim they'd witnessed our wedding. Damien's voice was steady. I was terrified that without documentation, Hale would destroy us. So I created it. That's fraud, Sullivan called out. That's testimony, Morrison said sharply. You'll get your turn, counselor, Price continued. Why are you admitting this now? Because my lawyer told me the truth was our best defense, Damien said, and because I'm tired of lying. Yes, I manipulated the initial evidence. Yes, I paid people to support a story that wasn't completely true. But here's what is true. Rosalie and I got married. For real. 2 weeks after that party, we stood in a church in Denver and made vows to each other. We've lived as husband and wife every day since. We've built a life together. The cooperative, the ranch, everything. That's not fake. The circumstances were desperate and unconventional, but what came after was real. The courtroom buzzed with reaction. Sullivan practically ran to the stand for cross-examination. You admit to bribing witnesses? Yes. To falsifying documents? To accelerating documentation that would have existed anyway, Damien corrected. We got married. I just made sure there was paper trail before Hale could stop us. That's not how the law works. I know, Damien interrupted. I knew it then. I did it anyway because the alternative was being forced into a marriage that would have destroyed me. If that makes me a criminal, then I'm a criminal, but I'm not a fraud. Rosalie is my wife. That's the truth. Sullivan tried to continue, but the damage was done. The jury had seen someone take responsibility rather than hide behind excuses. The final arguments came the next day. Sullivan painted them as calculated con artists. Price painted them as desperate people who'd found each other in impossible circumstances. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. When they filed back in, Rosalie couldn't read their faces. Judge Morrison called for the verdict. The jury foreman stood. On the charge of criminal fraud, we find the defendants not guilty. The courtroom exploded. Rosalie felt Damien's hand find hers, squeezing tight. Morrison gavelled for order. However, he said when the noise subsided, there is the matter of the falsified documents and bribed witnesses. Mr. Blackthorne, you admitted under oath to paying people to provide false testimony. That constitutes perjury and corruption. Rosalie's stomach dropped. I'm imposing a fine of $5,000 and 6 months probation, Morrison continued. Any further legal violations will result in jail time. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, Damien said. As for the marriage itself, Morrison said, looking at both of them, I find it to be legally valid, unconventional and poorly executed, but valid. Case dismissed. Another gavel strike. It was over. They'd won. Barely. Expensively. But they'd won. Outside the courthouse, cooperative members crowded around them, offering congratulations and support. Reporters shouted questions, and somewhere in the crowd, Victor Hale watched with an expression that promised this wasn't finished. But for the moment, standing in the late afternoon sun with Damien's hand still in hers and the weight of the trial finally lifted, Rosalie let herself feel something close to victory. They'd survived. Against impossible odds, against every expectation, they'd survived. And for people like them, survival was its own kind of winning. That night, back at the ranch, Rosalie found herself alone in the library while Damien dealt with well-wishers, and Mrs. Blackthorne managed the aftermath. Catherine Price appeared in the doorway. You did well in there. We got lucky, Rosalie said. You got honest. Price set down her case. That confession from Damien could have destroyed you, but it humanized you instead. Made the jury see you as people instead of criminals. Thank you, Rosalie said. For everything. Price nodded. My bill will reflect my appreciation. A small smile. But you're welcome. Try to stay out of court for a while. After she left, Damien appeared. Hell of a day, he said. Hell of a few months, Rosalie corrected. They stood in comfortable silence, both too drained for much else. I meant what I said on the stand, Damien said finally, about not regretting you. Rosalie looked at him. Even with all this? Especially with all this. He moved closer. You could have run a dozen times, could have taken money and disappeared. Instead, you built a cooperative, faced down Victor Hale, and testified in court knowing you might go to prison. That's not the behavior of someone who is just desperate. What is it the behavior of? Someone who belongs here, Damien said quietly. Someone who's home. The word hit Rosalie harder than she expected. Home. She'd been so focused on surviving she hadn't noticed when the ranch stopped feeling like a temporary shelter and started feeling like something permanent. Damien, I know this is complicated, he interrupted. I know we started this as a business arrangement, but somewhere along the way, it stopped being fake for me. And I need to know if... Rosalie kissed him. It was impulsive and terrifying and nothing like the desperate kiss in the storm. This was deliberate. A choice. When they broke apart, Damien looked stunned. It stopped being fake for me too, Rosalie said. I just didn't know how to say it. That worked, Damien managed. They stood close enough to share breath, both of them trembling slightly. So what now? Rosalie asked. Now we figure out how to actually be married, Damien said. For real this time. No lies, no pretending. Just us. That's terrifying. Completely. He smiled. But we've survived worse. And standing there in the library with the trial behind them and an uncertain future ahead, Rosalie thought maybe they could survive this too. Maybe they could even build something lasting out of the wreckage they'd started with. It wouldn't be easy. Victor Hale was still out there, still dangerous. The cooperative was fragile. The ranch was barely solvent. But for the first time since that chaotic night in the ballroom, Rosalie felt like the future was something she could choose instead of something that happened to her. And that made all the difference. The kiss changed things, but not in the ways Rosalie expected. They didn't suddenly become a perfect couple. Damien still slept on the floor most nights out of habit, and Rosalie still woke up wondering if this was all temporary. But something fundamental had shifted. They'd stopped pretending and started building something real, messy, and uncertain as it was. The morning after the trial, Rosalie woke to find a telegram waiting on the breakfast table. Mrs. Blackthorne handed it to her without comment, her expression unreadable. It was from Victor Hale. 6 words. This isn't over. Watch your back. Charming, Rosalie said, setting it down. He's going to come at us another way, Mrs. Blackthorne said. The trial didn't break us, so he'll find a different angle. Let him try, Damien said, appearing in the doorway. We survived fraud charges. We can survive whatever else he throws at us. But Mrs. Blackthorne's expression remained troubled. I've been running this ranch for 20 years. I know when a fight is about to get worse before it gets better. Victor doesn't make empty threats. She was right. Within a week, 3 cooperative members received letters informing them their supply contracts had been terminated. 2 others found their bank loan suddenly called in for immediate payment. And the railroad announced rate increases that would specifically affect ranchers shipping from the Northern Territory, exactly where most cooperative members operated. Hale was strangling them economically, and he was doing it methodically. Henderson showed up at the ranch on a freezing December morning, his face haggard. I can't keep doing this, Damien. The bank wants full payment on my mortgage by January or they're foreclosing. I don't have that kind of money. How much? Rosalie asked. $8,000. The number was staggering for a small operation like Henderson's, but Rosalie had been studying the cooperative finances, learning how the alliance could pool resources in ways individual ranchers couldn't. What if the cooperative bought your debt from the bank, she suggested, restructured it with better terms? Henderson blinked. You can do that? I don't know, Rosalie admitted, but we can try. Mrs. Blackthorne looked up from the ledger she'd been reviewing. It's risky. If Henderson defaults, the cooperative absorbs the loss. And if we don't help him, the cooperative loses a member and looks weak, Rosalie countered. Hale's betting will fracture under pressure. We need to prove we won't. Damien studied her. You're suggesting we buy out every threatened member's debt? I'm suggesting we act like an actual alliance, instead of a loose collection of scared ranchers. Rosalie pulled out the notes she'd been compiling. We have combined assets of over $500,000 if you count land and livestock. Most banks would extend credit against that if we structured it right. Most banks won't touch us because Hale controls too many of them, Mrs. Blackthorne said. Then we find ones he doesn't control, Rosalie said. Denver, San Francisco. There are banks outside Wyoming that would love to break Hale's monopoly if it means new business. Henderson looked between them, hope warring with skepticism. You really think this could work? I think we're out of other options, Rosalie said honestly. And I think doing nothing guarantees failure. At least this way we're fighting. They spent the next 2 weeks on a financial offensive that would have seemed impossible 3 months ago. Rosalie and Damien rode to Denver to meet with banks Hale didn't control. Mrs. Blackthorne leveraged every business connection she'd built over 2 decades. And slowly, painfully, they assembled a credit line large enough to buy out the most threatened cooperative members' debts. It wasn't charity. The members still owed money, just to the cooperative instead of banks controlled by Hale. But it bought time and sent a message. They weren't breaking. The strategy worked. By mid-December, they'd stabilized 8 operations. Other ranchers saw what was happening and asked to join the cooperative, seeing it as the only viable defense against Hale's economic warfare. But the expansion created new problems. More members meant more complexity, more disputes about resource allocation, more personalities clashing. What had started as a simple water-sharing agreement was becoming something closer to a full ranching corporation, and Rosalie found herself thrust into a leadership role she'd never asked for. "You're good at this," Damien said one night as they reviewed membership agreements in the library. "Better than I expected." "I worked in a factory for 6 years," Rosalie said. "I know how to manage complicated systems and keep difficult people working together. This isn't that different." "It's completely different," Damien said. "You're building something that could change how this entire territory operates. That's not factory work." Rosalie set down her pen. "Do you ever regret this? Not the marriage, the whole thing. Fighting Hale, building the cooperative, all of it." "Every day," Damien said honestly. "And then I remember what the alternative was, and the regret goes away." "What was the alternative?" "Marrying Margaret, spending my life as Victor Hale's son-in-law, making decisions that benefited his empire instead of actual people. Becoming exactly like my mother, competent, successful, and completely empty." He looked at Rosalie. "At least this way I'm empty for a purpose." "You're not empty," Rosalie said quietly. "Neither are you. But we both know what it's like to feel that way." The observation settled between them, true and uncomfortable. Christmas came, and with it the cooperative's first formal gathering, not a desperate strategy session, but an actual celebration. 32 member ranches sent representatives. The Blackthorne house was packed with people who 3 months ago would never have worked together. Rosalie stood in the kitchen, helping prepare food and listening to Mrs. Cooper and Mrs. Henderson gossip about the latest territorial news. It struck her how much had changed. These women who'd torn her apart at the Ladies' Aid Society were now treating her like an equal, not with warmth exactly, but with respect. "You've done well," Mrs. Cooper said, noticing Rosalie's attention. "For an outsider." "I'm still an outsider," Rosalie said. "Perhaps, but you're our outsider now." Mrs. Cooper's smile was almost genuine. "That counts for something in Wyoming." The celebration was interrupted by a rider arriving with urgent news. Victor Hale had filed new legal action, this time against the cooperative itself, claiming it violated territorial water laws and constituted an illegal monopoly. The irony of Victor Hale accusing anyone else of monopolistic behavior wasn't lost on anyone. "He's trying to tie us up in court again," Damien said, reading the documents. "Drain our resources with legal fees until we collapse." "Then we need to resolve this before it gets to trial," Mrs. Blackthorne said. "How?" Henderson asked. "Hale won't negotiate. He wants us destroyed." Rosalie thought about the past 3 months, about every fight, every small victory, every time they'd survived something that should have broken them. And she realized something fundamental. "He doesn't want us destroyed," she said slowly. "He wants control. There's a difference." Everyone turned to look at her. "What are you saying?" Damien asked. "I'm saying Hale spent millions building his empire. The lawsuits, the economic pressure, the railroad rates, all of it costs him money and time. He's doing it because he thinks we'll eventually surrender and accept his terms. But what if we offered him something he actually wants instead?" "Like what?" Mrs. Blackthorne asked, skeptical. "A seat at the table," Rosalie said. "The The cooperative is becoming powerful enough that fighting it is expensive even for Hale. But being part of it, having influence over how it operates, that might be more valuable than destroying it. You want to invite Victor Hale into our alliance? Henderson said incredulously. After everything he's done? I want to give him a choice, Rosalie corrected. Keep fighting us and spend the next decade in legal battles and economic warfare, or accept that the territory's changing and adapt to it. We don't have to give him control, just representation. That's insane, someone said. So was building the cooperative in the first place, Rosalie said. So was standing trial for fraud. We've done nothing but insane things for months. At least this one might actually end the war. Damien looked at his mother. What do you think? Mrs. Blackthorne was quiet for a long moment. I think it's the kind of bold stupidity that might actually work. Victor's a businessman first. If we can make cooperation more profitable than destruction, he'll consider it. And if he refuses? Henderson asked. Then we're no worse off than we are now, Mrs. Blackthorne said. But at least we tried. The vote was close. 16 in favor, 14 against, 2 abstaining, barely enough to proceed. Rosalie drafted the letter herself, choosing words carefully to balance strength with pragmatism. They weren't surrendering. They were offering partnership on specific terms. Hale could join the cooperative as a major member with proportional voting rights based on his holdings. In exchange, he had dropped the lawsuits and stopped the economic attacks. He'll never accept, Damien said as Rosalie sealed the envelope. Probably not, Rosalie agreed. But I'm betting he's tired too. Tired of fighting, tired of uncertainty, tired of spending resources on a war that's benefiting nobody. The response came faster than expected. 3 days later, Victor Hale himself arrived at the Blackthorne Ranch, alone, in a simple carriage that suggested this wasn't an official visit. Mrs. Blackthorne received him in the study with Rosalie and Damien present. The 4 of them sat in chairs arranged like negotiators, rather than enemies. That was quite a letter, Hale said, his voice neutral. It was an honest offer, Rosalie replied. Honest? Hale smiled without humor. After months of lies and legal maneuvering, you're claiming honesty now. We're claiming pragmatism, Mrs. Blackthorne said. You've spent a fortune trying to break us, Victor. We've spent one trying to survive you. At some point, this stops being business and starts being ego. Hale's eyes narrowed. You think this is about ego? I think you're angry that Damien rejected your daughter and embarrassed you publicly, Rosalie said bluntly. I think you wanted to punish us for that and prove nobody defies Victor Hale. But the punishment's lasting longer than the crime warranted, and it's costing you. You don't know what it's costing me, Hale said coldly. Then tell us, Rosalie challenged. Because from where I'm sitting, you're choosing revenge over profit. That's not the behavior of the shrewd businessman everyone claims you are. The study went very quiet. Hale stared at Rosalie with an expression somewhere between fury and reassessment. You're either very brave or very stupid, Mrs. Blackthorne. I've been called both, Rosalie said, usually by people who underestimated me. I'm not underestimating you, not anymore. Hale leaned back in his chair. What exactly are the terms you're proposing? They negotiated for 4 hours. Hale wanted majority control. The Blackthornes refused. He wanted veto power over major decisions. They offered him weighted voting based on asset contribution instead. He demanded the cooperative pay his legal fees. They agreed to split costs going forward, but nothing retroactive. It was brutal, exhausting work. But slowly, impossibly, an agreement took shape. Hale would join the cooperative as its largest single member, controlling roughly 30% of voting rights. The lawsuits would be dropped. The economic warfare would end. In exchange, the cooperative would gain access to Hale's water rights, railroad connections, and political influence, resources that would make them genuinely competitive across the territory. There's one more thing, Hale said as they were finalizing terms. I want a public apology from your son for the humiliation he caused my daughter. Damien's jaw tightened. No. Damien, Mrs. Blackthorne started. I won't apologize for choosing my own life, Damien said firmly. I'm sorry Margaret was hurt, genuinely sorry. But I won't apologize for refusing to marry her. Hale's expression hardened. Then we have no deal. Wait, Rosalie said. She looked at Margaret's father, seeing past the business mogul to the parent underneath. You don't want an apology. You want your daughter's dignity restored. There's a difference. What are you suggesting? Hale asked warily. A statement, Rosalie said. Something Damien and I released publicly acknowledging that Margaret was an innocent party in all this. That she deserved better than what happened. That the failure was ours, not hers. It's not an apology for choosing each other, but it is accountability for how we handled it. Damien looked at her surprised, then nodded slowly. I can do that. Hale considered this. It would need to be genuine, not some lawyer-written corporate nonsense. It will be, Rosalie promised. I'll write it myself. The deal was struck just before midnight. They'd signed formal papers within the week, but the handshake that sealed it felt more binding than any contract. After Hale left, the three of them sat in exhausted silence. Did that actually just happen? Damien asked. I think we just made peace with the devil, Mrs. Blackthorne said. Or we just changed the game entirely, Rosalie said. Time will tell which. The formal signing happened on a cold January morning with lawyers present and half the territory watching. The cooperative absorbed Hale's operations as a partnership, creating something unprecedented in Wyoming. A ranching alliance powerful enough to compete with even the largest individual operations, but structured democratically enough that no single person could control it. The newspapers called it everything from frontier socialism to the future of Western agriculture. Rosalie didn't care what they called it. She cared that 39 ranching families had a fighting chance to survive and prosper instead of being slowly strangled by monopoly power. But there was still unfinished business. Margaret Hale appeared at the ranch 2 weeks after the signing, asking to speak with Rosalie alone. They met in the library, two women who'd been enemies by circumstance rather than choice. I read your statement, Margaret said quietly. The one you released. Rosalie had spent 2 days writing it, making sure every word was honest without being cruel. They'd acknowledged Margaret's pain, taken responsibility for the chaos, and made clear she'd been caught in circumstances beyond her control. I meant every word, Rosalie said. I know. Margaret was quiet for a moment. I hated you. For months, I hated you so much I could barely function. I don't blame you. I'm not finished. Margaret met her eyes. But then I watched what you built. The cooperative, the trial, the way you turned disaster into something that actually helps people. And I realized something. What? You're stronger than I'll ever be, Margaret said simply. I spent my whole life doing what I was told, being what people expected. You showed up as a stranger and refused to be anything except yourself, even when everyone mocked you, even when it would have been easier to quit. Rosalie didn't know what to say to that. I'm not saying we're friends, Margaret continued, but I'm saying I understand now why Damien chose you, and I'm saying... She paused. I'm saying I hope you're happy, both of you, because at least someone should get happiness out of this mess. I'm sorry, Rosalie said, for how it happened, for your pain. I know, Margaret said, and I'm working on forgiving you. It might take a while. Take all the time you need, Rosalie said. After Margaret left, Rosalie sat in the library feeling like something important had just shifted. Not quite closure, but maybe the beginning of it. Damien found her there an hour later. That looked intense, he said. It was. Rosalie smiled slightly. But I think it was good, necessary. Damien sat beside her. We never talked about what happens next, now that the crisis is over and we're not actively fighting for survival. What do you want to happen? Rosalie asked. I want to stop sleeping on the floor, Damien said. I want to actually be married instead of pretending. I want to build a life that's ours instead of one we're defending from attack. He took her hand. What do you want? Rosalie thought about the question. 3 months ago, she'd wanted survival, safety, a place to belong. She'd achieved all that, but somewhere along the way, her wants had grown bigger. I want to keep building the cooperative, she said. Make it strong enough that nobody like Hale can ever dominate the territory again. I want to help other women who show up desperate and alone, give them chances nobody gave me. And I want... She squeezed his hand. I want to figure out who I am when I'm not just surviving, when I actually have space to become something. I like the sound of that, Damien said. Which part? All of it. He kissed her forehead. Want to start tonight? Start what? Being married, for real. He smiled. I'll even take the bed if you're offering. Rosalie laughed. "That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me." "I'm working on it." That night, for the first time since arriving in Wyoming, Rosalie shared an actual bed with her actual husband. It was awkward and strange, and neither of them slept much. But it was real. No performance, no pretending. Just two people trying to figure out how to be together. The cooperative continued to grow through the spring. 47 members by March, 52 by April. The structure they'd built became a model. Other territories started asking for advice on creating similar alliances. Rosalie found herself writing letters to farmers in Montana, ranchers in Colorado, even a group in Oregon trying to resist railroad monopolies. What had started as desperate survival had become something larger, a blueprint for people refusing to be crushed by forces more powerful than themselves. Mrs. Blackthorne noticed the change in her son and daughter-in-law. She didn't comment directly, but one evening she pulled Rosalie aside. "I misjudged you," she said without preamble. "That first night, I thought you were either a con artist or a fool. I was wrong on both counts." "I was a little bit of both," Rosalie said honestly. "Perhaps. But you were also brave and stubborn and smarter than anyone gave you credit for, including me." Mrs. Blackthorne's expression softened slightly. "My son is happy, genuinely happy. I haven't seen that since before his father died. So, thank you." "I didn't do it for gratitude," Rosalie said. "I know. That's why it matters." Mrs. Blackthorne paused. "I'm getting older. This ranch needs someone who understands both the business and the people. I'd like you to start learning how to run it. Properly, not just crisis management." Rosalie blinked. "You want me to manage the Blackthorne Ranch?" "Eventually, when I'm ready to step back." Mrs. Blackthorne smiled slightly. "Consider it an investment in the family business, and in you." It wasn't quite an apology for the coldness of those first months, but it was acceptance, real acceptance. "I'd be honored," Rosalie said. Spring turned to summer. The cooperative hosted its first official territorial meeting, with representatives from ranches across Wyoming gathering to discuss water management, shared infrastructure, and collective bargaining. Rosalie stood before them, this plus-size woman from Philadelphia who'd arrived 6 months ago with nothing but desperation, and helped facilitate discussions that would shape the territory's future. Some people still whispered about her, still questioned her legitimacy, her appearance, her right to be there. Rosalie had stopped caring. She'd learned something important over the past months. Power wasn't given by people who thought you deserved it. Power was taken by people brave enough to use it. She'd taken hers piece by piece, decision by decision, until it became undeniable. In August, Damien suggested they have a real wedding. Not the desperate ceremony in Denver, but something public and celebratory. "We're already married," Rosalie pointed out. "I know, but we got married out of fear and necessity. I want to marry you because I choose you, because I love you. There's a difference." The words hung between them. They'd never quite said it directly before, had danced around the concept, implied it through actions, but never spoken it clearly. "You love me?" Rosalie asked. "Completely," Damien said. "Inconveniently. Possibly since the night you saved those horses in the storm and came back covered in mud looking like you'd fought the entire world and won." Rosalie felt tears prick her eyes. "I love you too, though I'm not sure exactly when it happened." "Does it matter?" "No," Rosalie said. "I guess it doesn't." They held the wedding in late September, exactly 1 year after that chaotic engagement party. The entire cooperative came. Henderson gave Rosalie away since her own family was absent. Mrs. Cooper cried, which surprised everyone, including herself. Even Victor Hale attended, sitting in the back with Margaret beside him, both wearing expressions of complicated acceptance. The ceremony was simple. Rosalie wore a dress she'd sewn herself, not because she couldn't afford better, but because she wanted something that represented who she was instead of who people expected her to be. Damien wore his best suit and looked genuinely happy instead of just going through motions. When they exchanged vows this time, they wrote them themselves. "I promise to keep choosing you," Damien said. "Even when it's hard. Even when it would be easier to quit. I choose you." "I promise to keep building with you," Rosalie said. "To fight beside you. To be exactly who I am, and let you be exactly who you are. No pretending." They kissed to applause that felt genuine instead of obligatory. At the reception, Rosalie found herself talking with Mrs. Mitchell, who'd become one of the cooperative's strongest advocates. "You did something remarkable," Mrs. Mitchell said. "Not just surviving, but changing how this entire territory operates." "I just did what needed doing," Rosalie said. "That's what makes it remarkable." Mrs. Mitchell smiled. "Most people see what needs doing and wait for someone else to do it. You didn't wait." Later, dancing with Damien in the barn they'd converted into a celebration space, Rosalie looked around at the faces of people who'd become allies, friends, family. People who'd started as strangers or enemies, but were now part of something bigger than any individual. "What are you thinking?" Damien asked. "I'm thinking about that first night," Rosalie said. "Walking into your engagement party in mud-stained boots while everyone laughed. If someone had told me then that a year later I'd be here doing this, I would have thought they were insane." "Would you change anything?" Damien asked. "If you could go back knowing what you know now." Rosalie considered the question seriously. She thought about the humiliation, the fear, the desperate months of fighting just to survive. She thought about the pain they'd caused Margaret, the risks they'd taken, the laws they'd bent. "No," she said finally. "I wouldn't change anything. Because all of it, the good and the terrible, made this possible. Made us possible. No regrets?" "About 1,000 regrets," Rosalie said honestly, "but none that make me wish I'd chosen differently." They danced until the stars came out, surrounded by people who'd learned the same lesson Rosalie had. That strength wasn't about being perfect or flawless or what society expected. Strength was about refusing to break when breaking would be easier, about choosing to build instead of surrender, about believing you deserved space in the world even when everyone told you otherwise. Months later, as autumn turned to winter again, Rosalie stood on the porch of the Blackthorne ranch, watching snow fall across the Wyoming frontier. She was wearing a dress she'd designed herself, carrying ledgers for the cooperative that now had 63 member ranches, and thinking about the future. Damien came out to join her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "Cold?" he asked. "A little," Rosalie admitted, "but I like it." "The cold?" "The reminder that I survived it. That first night, walking through the cold to get here, I thought I might die. Instead, I built a life." Damien pulled her closer. "We built a life." "We did," Rosalie agreed. They stood together watching the snow, two people who'd started as strangers playing dangerous games and ended up as partners building something real. The woman everyone had mocked for being too fat, too poor, too everything wrong, had become the heart of a movement that changed how an entire territory operated. The rancher who'd been sold like cattle had found freedom by choosing love over obligation. And together, they'd proven something Rosalie had always suspected but never quite believed until now. That worth wasn't determined by appearance, background, or what powerful people decided you deserved. Worth was something you claimed for yourself and defended with everything you had. Standing under the Wyoming sky with Damien's arm around her and the future spreading out uncertain but chosen, Rosalie understood the truth at last. She'd stopped being the woman who stumbled into that ballroom desperate and alone. She'd become the woman who built an empire from nothing, who stared down powerful men and won, who transformed humiliation into power. Not because she was perfect, not because it was easy, but because she'd refused to accept that her story was already written. She'd written her own ending instead, and it was better than any beginning anyone could have imagined for her.